Okay, here we go. I'm going to share a bunch of screens. This is about women, not only mainly in Christianity, but first I'm going to start off with outside of Christianity and women who were written out of history kind of the same way that Nikola Tesla was in the science realm. And let me get out that link here and share it. And if you'll hold on just a second, I've got a few things up. And let me present that. You should be able to see a page that says The Woman Whom Science Forgot. And let me just put that there. Okay. I'm just going to run through these real quick because they're not thanks, Kathleen, for coming on the panel with me. And
thanks for hosting this.
Hey, no problem. There seems to be some interest in it. So I'm glad to hear that. A lot of other people were interested too. And, jump in with a question anytime. I'll find my way back to whatever I was doing. You can help me remember too.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, women whom science forgot. And we're going to start off here with, this is a picture of Dorothy Hodgkin. She won a Nobel Prize, but nobody knows her name. Of course, everybody knows they start off mentioning Marie Curie, physicist and chemist, who basically discovered radiation and helped apply it in the field of X-rays. She had 2 Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry. Yet she was turned down for membership in the prestigious French Academy of Science in 1911, the year she won her 2nd Nobel Prize. So, and there's no explanation for that except her gender. I'm going to skip over that. It was a news item. Some guy was very critical of women in science. He lost his job. Dorothy Hodgkin, back to her, she was a crystallographer who mapped the structure of penicillin and went on to be awarded a Nobel Prize in 1964. She was the first to win the Copley Medal, remains the only British woman to have won a Nobel in the sciences, and all the headlines at the time said, Oxford housewife wins Nobel. And that's all they said. Isn't that pathetic?
That is.
All right, so more, just a few. They say here, Esther Lederberg, a microbiologist, American, groundbreaking research in genetics. She developed basic techniques that have gone a long way towards helping scientists understand how genes work. Her work helped her husband Joshua win a Nobel Prize in 1958, but she was not cited in the award. British biophysicist Rosalind Franklin was a pioneering X-ray crystallographer. Her image of the DNA molecule was critical to deciphering its structure, one of the biggest and most important scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century, but it was James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins who received the 1962 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work. So once again, the men are taking credit for what the women did. And Franklin died in 1958, 4 years before the men got the prize instead of her. Yeah. If it was just 1 or 2, they're like, well, oversights, but no. And these are Nobel winners. So I don't think even if there was just one of them that it would have been something that we could just brush off. Ida Tacke, I'm not sure how to pronounce any of these names, found 2 new elements that had been predicted would be part of the periodic table. She got credit in science books for the discovery of rhenium, but the other is they changed the name and gave the discovery attributes to guys. Her evidence was ignored until the others artificially created the element in the lab. And she is credited with being the first person to open up the idea of nuclear fission. Be that as may, whatever we might think about nuclear power, the point is that in mainstream science, this sort of thing goes on. Lise Meitner, work in nuclear physics, led to the discovery of nuclear fission. and laid the groundwork for the atomic bomb. She collaborated with a chemist for many decades, but the chemist published their findings without including Meitner as a co-author. So, you know, these women are building up these men's careers and they get no credit for it. And he went on to win the 1944 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. There's Lise Meitner, Chinese lady, whatever. My sons could pronounce that. Chien-Shiung participated in the development of the atom bomb, part of the Manhattan Project. Two other physicists asked Wu to help disprove what is known in physics as the law of parity, and she was successful. But the 1957 Nobel Prize went to the other two guys, but not for Wu. Another neglected pioneer, the astronomer Henrietta Leavitt, who changed the way we see the universe. She began her work, you know, being the standard model and all, but nevertheless, she was not credited for the work she did. She measured and recorded stars at Harvard Observatory, spotted a pattern between the brightness of a star and its alleged distance. I put alleged in there. Led her to uncover what is known as the period luminosity relationship. But let's see, the Royal Society. Oh, they're talking about that guy in the news a while back who was dismissed for his remarks on women in science. But this Royal Society has yet to elect a female president. Women were not permitted to become fellows until 1945, almost 300 years after its foundation. And let's see, only 6% of its fellows are women. So that's just an intro to the glass ceiling that is very real, and that's just in one field. You know, science in general, you know, a bunch of fields, but one area. Mm-hmm. Just science. And now we're going to look at some more of them from another site, and I have these sites in the description. In April, National Geographic News published a story about a letter in which Francis Crick described DNA to his 12-year-old son. He got the Nobel Prize, so they got some of the same material, a little bit different, you know, details you can read about. There's the Rosalind Franklin. I think I mentioned her in the other one. Yeah, she's the one that got totally snubbed for her work on DNA. Not the first woman to have suffered such indignities. Over the centuries, women in general in academia have had to work as volunteer faculty members and been written out of the textbooks because they were not given the positions they would need in order to be mentioned, even though they're doing the same work as men who are easily inducted into those positions. They typically had paltry resources and fought uphill battles to achieve what they did, only to have the credit attributed to their husbands or male colleagues, says this Anne Lincoln, who did a study on these things. Not much has changed. People, they say that women go into these studies in college now with better hopes, but they find out when they get there that nothing much has changed. 6 researchers that names are likely unfamiliar. Jocelyn Burnell, Northern Ireland, 1943, discovered pulsars in 1967 while a grad student in radio astronomy at Cambridge University. Discovered the recurring signals given off by the rotation. While analyzing data printed out on 3 miles of paper from a radio telescope she helped assemble. Finding resulted in a Nobel Prize, but the 1974 award in physics went to Anthony Hewish, her supervisor, and Martin Riley, also a radio astronomer at Cambridge. So once again, the woman does the work, the men take the credit. The snub generated a wave of sympathy for her, but in an interview with National Geographic News, the astronomer was fairly matter of fact. The picture people had at the time, the way science was done, was that there was a senior man, and was always a man, who had under him a whole load of minions, junior staff, who were not expected to think, who were only expected to do as he said. So they were trying to excuse the attitude of not giving credit where it was due, because the people under the head of the department were not expected to be actually making contributions. But in the case of women, they were certainly doing that. But despite the sympathy in her groundbreaking work, Burnell said she was still subject to the prevailing attitudes toward women in academia. Hard to get research jobs, combining family and career, no provisions for maternity leave. Chaired a working group recently to boost the number of women. So more of the same. Another one, Esther Lederberg, laid the groundwork for future discoveries on genetic inheritance in bacteria, and another gene work there. Discovered a virus that infects bacteria while at the University of Wisconsin. Her husband, Joshua, also developed a way to transfer bacteria from one petri dish to another, so she co-worked with him on that. But his work was played a part in getting him the 1958 Nobel Prize, which he shared with two other men. She deserves credit, the quote here, for the discovery of the lambda phage, which is, what that thing was that she developed earlier, and her work, especially replica plating, but she didn't receive it, of course. Wasn't treated fairly in spite of her academic standing. She had to fight just to be appointed as a research associate professor, whereas she surely would have been afforded full professorial rank. She was not alone. Women were treated badly in academia in those days, and they sure still are. There's the Chinese lady again that we met before, Lise Meitner, also. Rosalind Franklin, I think we mentioned her already. Nettie Stevens performed studies crucial in determining that an organism's sex was dictated by its chromosomes rather than environmental or other factors. Fellow researcher Edmund Wilson done similar work but came to the same conclusions later than Stevens, but Stevens fell victim to a phenomenon known as the Matilda effect, the repression or denial of the contributions of female researchers to science. Credit went to somebody else. And textbooks in general have this terrible tendency to choose the same evidence as other textbooks, so they just copy each other, and that's, whoever is the leading textbook maker gets to decide the content of pretty much all of them. So they were showing here that people would try to make excuses, and they countered those arguments, and how people just dismissed women in general. So there's some more. Then in programming, which is kind of my thing, I was a programmer. My first main job was a programmer. And they explain how things have gone downhill in programming as far as representing women in the field. Decades ago, it was women who pioneered computer programming. Skipping down here, let's see, Ada Lovelace was the person after whom I think it was Steve Jobs that named the first language or a system or something of his Apple beginnings, named it Ada after her. And this was back in 1815 that she lived. She was Lord Byron's child, and her mother did not want her to turn out to be like her father, a romantic poet, so she had her tutored almost exclusively in math, as if that were an antidote to being poetic. But Lovelace saw the poetry in math. At 17, she went to London's Salon and met Charles Babbage. Everybody knows Charles Babbage. And he showed her plans for a calculating machine, and he asked her to write about his work for a scholarly journal. In her article, she expresses a vision for his machine that goes beyond calculation. She envisioned that a computer can do anything that can be noted logically, words, picture, music, not just numbers, and how to make an instruction set to load into the machine. So she was the first programmer.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it says she even does an example, which is programming Bernoulli numbers, an incredibly complicated sequence of numbers. Babbage's machine was never built, but his designs and Lovelace's notes were read by people building the first computer a century later. But the women who would program one of the world's earliest electronic computers knew nothing of Lovelace and Babbage. So history is not being taught to programmers even. Let's see. As a part of the oral history, Jennings Bartik recalled how she got the job working on that computer. She was doing calculations on rocket and cannon trajectories by hand in 1945. Announcement that they were building the ENIAC, which most programmers know about. And she was one of 6 female mathematicians who created programs for one of the world's first fully electronic general purpose computers. The men didn't think it was an important job. That's why the women were in there. They didn't think it was important. The men were interested in building the hardware, doing the circuits, figuring out the machinery, and the women were very good mathematicians back then.
Interesting.
Not true today. And so it's a cultural thing. It's not a genetic thing. In the 1930s, female math majors were fairly common, but during World War II, these skilled women signed up to help with the war effort. ENIAC was not working the day before its first demo, but Bartik's team, the ladies' team, worked late into the night and got it working. They all went out, here's a quote, they all went out to dinner at the announcement. She says, we weren't invited, and there we were. People never recognized and never acted as though we knew what we were doing. You know, they're in all these pictures. They were not invited to the dinner for the opening of the thing that they got working just because they were women. Media did not name the women in the pictures. After the war, Bartik and her team went on to work at UNIVAC. There's another familiar name to programmers. They joined up with Grace Hopper, a tenured math professor who joined the Navy Reserve during the war. Says Hopper had a breakthrough. She found a way to program computers using words rather than numbers, most notably a program language called COBOL, which I learned in my first programming classes. Common Business Oriented Language, that stands for.
I enjoyed that class.
Did you? Did you get to take that?
Yeah. Lost in loop.
Yeah, it was very wordy and inefficient, but hey, it was groundbreaking because otherwise you were doing ones and zeros or at best hexadecimal notation. So anyway, she goes on and said you would be using a language that would allow you to almost give it instructions almost in regular English, and it compiled it for whatever hardware it happened to be. So that made programming more important than the hardware. Hopper retired from the Navy Reserve as a rear admiral. Act of Congress allowed her to stay past retirement age, and she was on David Letterman in 1986. I saw a clip of that. She was still very sharp-minded, even though she was up in years.
Wow.
Yeah, she was 79 then, and still very sharp-minded.
I wonder if we can still get a hold of that clip.
I'll bet it's around YouTube somewhere. Ruth Hopper, David Letterman. I'll bet if you look that up, you'd find it. It was also about this time that the number of women majoring in computer science began to drop from close to 40% to around 17% now, which is sad. A number of theories. It was about this time that Jobs and Gates were appearing in the media, personal computers. And boys who have been tinkering with the hardware at home look like better candidates to computer science departments than girls who like math. So it's kind of how one of the factors in changing the demographics of it. Let's see. When they have been written out of the history, you don't have great role models. So it's a way of spiraling that downward that is all too familiar in other areas as well. They get rid of you, your demographic, and then people come to assume that your demographic isn't interested or isn't qualified, and down it goes. Linda Lovelace, the mathematician, died when she was only 36. The women who worked on ENIAC have all passed away, has also Grace Hopper. But every time you use a computer, you're using tools that might not exist without the work of these women. So,
yay!
Those are things that few people learn. I mean, even as a programmer, I only learned the guys' names. That's all they ever talk about. And let me take a little break here. I'm going to replace those with other links here in a minute. I think someone else wants to join the panel. Let me check. Did you want on the panel, lady? Or Pillbox? Anybody? welcome to come on. It's always nice to have people to talk to, but I can monologue pretty well on this if you want. Oh, we have a downvote already. That's I feel like I've arrived now. Yeah, it just wouldn't be right if I didn't have a downvote, you know. Then you know you've got more attention than it's letting on. Yeah,
especially when it says that there's only 2 people watching.
Right.
Which I know is not true.
Right. Go and figure how they calculate these things. But
yeah, there's more than 2 people watching.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess if you have a lot of regular admitted activity, then they'll give you more, pad your numbers. I don't know what their algorithm might be in YouTube. Who knows? You know, something they might want to monetize someday. I'm just loading up some more links here.
Okay.
And then after I go through those, I'll load up some more. Let's see. Let me check the chat. Let me know if there's anything I need to see in the chat, if you would.
Okay, I will.
Kind of trying to manage these links here.
Okay.
All right. We're going to talk about more specifically on the Bible now. Given that in history in general, I mean, think of all the women we will never hear about for one reason or another in all sorts of fields: medicine, literature, government. There's even going to be a bunch in the Bible here that you never hear about, even in a lifetime of Sunday school and sermons, as I've had. You never hear about these people, or if you do, it's very glossed over and toned down. Okay. This website I'm sharing now is called God's Word to Women. It is named after a series of Bible lessons that were published in newspapers about a century ago, I think. I'm trying to see if they had the date here. I'm just going off memory from her book that I had, and this is basically her book online.
Okay.
And the author is Katherine Bushnell, as you can see there. She was a medical doctor and missionary and a linguist. And she knew Greek and Hebrew and went off to China, first of all, to translate and spread the gospel there and serve medical needs. And she discovered when she got there that the Bible had been, well, first of all, let me say she also championed women's causes in general there, because she saw the awful practice of foot binding, where small feet were valued on Chinese women, and so they would wrap their baby girls' feet really tight and deforming the feet actually to try to force them to be small.
Right.
So all these, the Chinese, the women would grow up, crippled essentially, and unspeakable pain probably for many years for the girls as they grew up. But she tried to put a stop to that as a medical doctor and explain why this was bad, why it was unhealthy. And she also discovered that in those days, China was an outpost, you could say, occupied sort of by the British Army, and they would station their officers there, and the officers wanted places where they could get girls who were disease-free. So it was they had these houses set up for these Chinese girls to be used by the British officers. And she discovered this, and also went on eventually to be one of the suffragettes, and she went different places around the world, including Canada, where they had logging camps where the same thing was going on there. There were girls being kept there for the loggers. And so she was a champion of women's rights then. But she also discovered in China that the Bible was being deliberately mistranslated when it came to what the Bible said about women. Well, there's no need to do that if the Bible is already saying what people are trying to tell you it says. So the fact that they changed the original, they took the original languages and mistranslated them into Chinese to suit the patriarchal culture tells you that the Bible does not teach that naturally. And she began to wonder why, if they would do this with Chinese, I wonder what else they've done it with. And she started looking at English translations and started to write these lessons. And that's what the basis of this site is. So that's in the description. You can spend quite a number of days reading these things, especially under the tab 100 lessons. That's her original work. There's other material there by the blogger. And but here they give it in order, the paragraphs number, lesson number, page in the book if you buy the book. And it's mostly Old Testament because that was more of her specialty, was Hebrew. And so she, and I didn't agree with some of her conclusions on prophecy and a couple of other things toward the end there, but she blows open holes in a lot of the Hebrew mistranslations, even by the, I did a video on Paleo Hebrew that when it was changed to the Phoenician script, which is now the familiar square script that we associate with Hebrew, it's got little dots up above and below the letters. That's vowel pointing. It's because the originals had no, either in Phoenician or Paleo Hebrew, did not have vowels written. They only wrote the consonants. And so vowels were added to supply the pronunciation of the words, but those were not added until very much later. So the opportunity was there. Go ahead.
If you change where the vowels are placed, that would change the definition of the word too. Is that right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Katherine Bushnell went into that in one of those lessons where she talks about, I'll see if I can remember the title, but she talks about how they deliberately mistranslated. There's one verse in the Old Testament that talks about that a curse that God is putting on Israel and that women shall rule over you and children, this and that. And she says, no, that's not what it said originally at all. And she showed how similar the two Hebrew words were and that vowel pointing made all the difference and that they pointed it deliberately in a misogynistic way. Let me see if I can find that real quick here. That's a little too far. I don't know. I think that's a little too early. Oh, well, maybe that's it. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's not it. Anyway, basically, it did not say women and children, and she appealed to the Septuagint as well to clarify, and it said, given the context, it made a lot more sense to say that these words should have been like accountants or exactors or gleaners, people who robbed like our IRS did, tax collectors. That's what the word always meant in every other instance, but they changed it to women and children in this one instance only to make it sound like something, that having women in leadership was a curse. And I'll show you verses where throughout the Old Testament where there were women in leadership positions at the appointment of God. So this is hardly a curse. And so at any rate, Katherine Bushnell spent a large number of years and a lot of research exposing all those what she called sophistries. Let me go on to another woman there's an organization, this is the same God's Word to Women site. She had an organization called Christians for Biblical Equality. She was an adjunct associate professor of classical and ministry studies at Theological Seminary, Gordon Conwell. Has a PhD, she's passed away now, had a PhD in classical studies from University of Minnesota. A little bio on her, but she read Katherine Bushnell's writing and did more research of her own and went on to make huge contributions to also highlighting more of the New Testament problems in translation. And in particular, she mentions Bushnell's targeting of the Greek word authentane. We'll get more into that later, which is what's called in Greek a hapax legomen, which means it only happens once, a word that only happens once in the entire Bible. You will only find this word once, at least New Testament Greek. I think it may appear in a different form in the Old Testament Septuagint, but in the New Testament, it's only seen once. And when you have a word that only happens once, you only have one context to interpret it. And so you have to go outside of the Bible and look for its classical usage and secular usage to find out what it means. And of course, it doesn't mean what most translators have decided to make it mean because they could. At any rate, this is another influential person whose name everyone should know who wants to know anything about women in Christianity. This is a good name. This site, this Rachel Held Evans, I have a lot of disagreement with her theology, but she does have a lot of things right, too, when it comes to especially women in Christianity. And she's going to mention some verses here that I'm going to go into in more detail. But she points out that there's no doubt the Bible was written in a patriarchal culture. That's a tongue twister. I'm having all sorts of those tonight. Patriarchal culture. Try to say that 5 times fast.
Go ahead.
No.
Try. Okay. All right.
And she listed the Old Testament things that you always hear atheists bring up whenever they want to critique the Bible. They take them out of context, but nevertheless, there is the patriarchal situation that the Bible was written in, and that women are identified as property. And these verses here, you can see damages for rape laws, virginity expectations only on girls, valued less in vows, vow taking, more impurity requirements for the birth of a girl than a boy, all sorts of things. Polygamy was common, concubines were common, impregnating slaves was common. And so she's just listing these things right here. She's not saying one thing pro or con about them. She's just listing them at first. But she's saying that sometimes egalitarians, meaning from the word French word, I think, for equality, that's the word that has been used most often for this movement, sometimes gloss over these passages and try to explain them away. She doesn't do that. And she goes on to talk about other things that she's written or experiments, where she actually, she's written this book, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, where she lived out the patriarchal rules from the other organization I've mentioned privately, Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, also known as CBMW. And they teach, like, for example, what the Duggar family, the infamous Duggar family of TV fame that have lost their show because of their pedophile son. That's the kind of teachings they were living out. And she lived that for a year just to make sure she knew what she was critiquing. So that's just the kind of person she is. But she lists some of these women of the Bible and points out that, for example, Deborah, Judges 2:16, was one of the judges. The judges were a group of people in a history in Israel where there were no kings, but from time to time, God would raise up someone as called a judge to lead the nation and, against enemies or whatnot. And one of them, Samson was one that we always hear about, the most famous one probably. Another was Deborah. At the beginning of Judges 4, the text reports that Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. As a prophet, judge, Deborah exercised complete religious, political, judicial, and militaristic authority over the people of Israel. She was Israel's commander-in-chief, said to issue her rulings from beneath the palm in the hills of Ephraim. So we know who this person was. She was not just, not unknown at all, and she was leading the nation. And she had a place where she held court, basically. Judges 4 and 5 records her successful military campaign against Sisera. And Barak, interestingly enough, was the name of the man who was commanding the army at the time. And he refused to go into battle without her. So and she had told him, go on, you can go on without me, but he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't go without her. So she prophesied that the glory for the battle would go to a woman instead of to him. And it turns out that another woman, she names here, called Jael, and here what she did is she lured Sisera into her tent and got him to fall asleep, giving him milk and I think goat's milk or something, and she lulled him to sleep and then drove a tent peg through his temples. You don't hear that in Sunday school. Yes. So the prophecy came true, needless to say. And this is, the quote here I have highlighted by Rachel Held Evans is saying the gentle and quiet spirit, of Jael. This is how she demonstrated it. She was quiet, all right, but not so gentle.
No.
But here we have two women leading, one woman is leading the armies and the other is actually killing the opposing king. So these were, this prophet, this judge was raised up by God, just like Samson or anybody else. So nobody can say that a woman leading the nation is a curse of God. I mean, they'd have to say, the people who say this are saying the Bible is inerrant. So if it's inerrant, then they're between a rock and a hard place, because here we have an example of God doing exactly what they say God would never do, unless it's a curse. And the only curse here was that, the male leader of the army did not get the credit because he was a coward, basically. He wouldn't go into battle without her, I should say. And one of the oldest military poems in the Near East was the Song of Deborah, where she did after the victory. They enjoyed 40 years of peace under her rule until violence began again. Miriam was the sister of Moses, and in scripture, she is cited as a prophet and a leader, just like Moses. The prophet Micah, no less, identifies Miriam as one of the three leaders sent by God to bring Israel out of Egypt, Micah 6:4. She is identified as a prophetess, and she seems to have held special responsibilities in leading the Israelites in worship. So here she's a prophet and a worship leader, and most churches, many of them at least, will not have a woman leading worship or a minister of music or anything like that, because that's authoritative or something. Some nonsense like that. But here's Miriam, no less, the sister of Moses, doing that very thing. And this is still Old Testament. We haven't even gotten to our freedom in Christ yet. And she says the same thing. There are complementarian churches. Complementarian is a euphemism, is a kind way of saying patriarchal. That's the term they've chosen. Complementary usually means like your left and right hand. That's what it normally means. You compliment someone, that doesn't mean you're under them. It means that they lack something, you lack something, and between the two of you, you fill in all the holes. And so that's what it means to compliment. But they have twisted this term and spun it to mean a hierarchy, to mean the exact opposite of complimenting. But anyway, that's a common term, complementarian churches that forbid women from reading scripture aloud in church. And here we have these other women, Deborah, Miriam, so far, doing things that today's Christian pastors would tell you are sinful. And she lists a few more. There's another lady named Huldah, there was a King Josiah, described as Israel's last good king, that reigned for 31 years. Before the Babylonian exile. About halfway through, he learned that the long-lost book of the law, the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, had been discovered in the temple. Upon hearing the words of the Torah read aloud, he tore his robes in repentance and summoned a prophet. And it's important to note that the contemporaries of Josiah included the famed prophets Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk, but Josiah did not ask any help from any of those men. Instead, he chose Huldah, a woman and prophet who lived in Jerusalem. So the argument is normally that Huldah was chosen because there were no men available, but that's certainly not the case with her. Scott McKnight is another good author to read. He says, she is chosen because she's truly exceptional among the prophets. What she did for the king was first confirm the scroll's authenticity to make sure that it was in fact the Torah. And then she told Josiah that the disobedience of Israel would indeed lead to its destruction, but that Josiah himself would die in peace. Thus, Huldah did not only interpret, but also authorize the document that would become the core of Jewish and Christian scripture. And her prophecy was fulfilled 35 years later, 2 Kings 22. So here again, we have not even reached the more free and fulfilled New Testament, and we have women doing all these things that the so-called complementarians would forbid all Christian women to do. And so they wouldn't even have the Torah without this woman who authenticated it. Many other prophets, you can read some of the names here, and there's some of the New Testament. Let's see. For some reason, I forgot to put that in the list. The daughters of Philip. I don't think I put that there in the description, or I just made a mention quick. Philip he's called Philip the Evangelist in the New Testament, and you read about him in the book of Acts. And he had 4 daughters who prophesied, the Bible says. So they were prophets, 4 of his daughters. And what a prophet does, it's like the difference between a prophet and a priest. A priest represents the people to God and makes sacrifices on their behalf to God. And the prophet does the opposite. The prophet speaks from God to the people. Okay, so that's what a prophet did. It isn't just predicting the future. It's speaking on God's behalf. Thus saith the Lord kind of thing, which Deborah also did. I mean, if you read that passage about Deborah, she was saying, this is what the Lord says. And you'll find that phrase all over the Old Testament for all the prophets. They all say that. And so she said the exact same thing. At any rate, there are 4 listed in the New Testament. Rachel is another name that, not just Rachel Held Evans here, but Rachel of the Old Testament. And Hannah, Abigail, Elizabeth, Mary, all sorts of, Mary, of course, Elizabeth and Mary are New Testament. Abigail was a woman who did another thing that the complementarians say that women shouldn't do in the church. The situation was when the time of King David, and her husband was called Nabal. You can look up this in the Old Testament. And his name means fool. And he was a belligerent, alpha male kind of person and a fool. And he had defied King David's armies. So King David was on his way to wipe the guy out and all his possessions and people and animals. And his wife was so, she was going to save everybody. So she went ahead without his knowledge or permission and got up a bunch of donkey loads of goodies and set out herself to meet King David on the way and convinced him not to pay any attention to her fool of a husband. And because she intervened, David relented and did not attack the village. So she saved everybody's life. And then God struck Nabal down with paralysis. It seems from the description that he probably had a stroke, and he was stiff as a log for a number of days, and then he died. So she's another example, her whole story, of a woman doing what they're trying to forbid Christian women from doing, defying her husband and taking charge of the situation and protecting her family and her whole tribe, actually. So that's another good story. In the line of Jesus, there are several women, one of which was Rahab the prostitute in Jesus' lineage, and she's named in the genealogies in the New Testament, at least one of them. There's 2 different genealogies. One is from Mary's perspective and one is from Joseph's perspective, because one is a legal line, a kingly line, and the other is a more patriarchal line. So at any rate, she was an innkeeper too. And she welcomed the Israeli spies who were checking out Jericho and gave them lodging and hid them. And she helped them escape without being discovered. And they spared her when they actually came and Jericho fell and all that. So she is one of King David's ancestors and then eventually Jesus' ancestors. So lots of women are named in the Old Testament as exemplary, as leaders, as brave, as wise, and taking charge. And there's one even in Proverbs 31, a hypothetical woman, but she is described in the highest terms. She's described as wise, as hardworking. She has her own business. She assesses land by herself without anybody's permission or advice and buys it with her own money. She has employees. They're called servant girls in the passage, but they're basically employees. And her husband praises her, and he's a prominent guy in the city. I always joke about it because it says she does all this work, and her husband sits at the gate. But of course, what they mean is he's got a prominent position in the city, and he praises her as wise and the best of all the women and all that stuff. But she is hypothetical, and she has her own business, though. She's being praised for her wisdom, hard work, and take charge attitude. In the Old Testament,
what do you mean hypothetical?
She is an ideal. There is, hard to believe when you read the passage that one woman could do all these things, but this is a woman advising her son who was about to become king. And he's saying, this is the epitome, this is the ideal, this is ultimate womanhood here. Okay, and she's talking to her son and showing him what a woman is, what a real woman is. And she doesn't talk about, made up beauty or anything like that, or subservience or obedience. She talks about the woman being independent, having a business and managing not only her family, but her employees, and selling her products in the marketplace. So here again, we have so many examples, all in the Old Testament so far, of women. And we have two other women I'd like to mention before I go to the New Testament. One of them is Ruth. People say that no woman wrote a book of the Bible. Well, who wrote Ruth? And if you say, well, a woman couldn't write in those days, so it couldn't have been a woman, then we could say, well, you know what? A lot of the Bible was written by someone else, a scribe who wrote for the prophet or whatever. And even the Apostle Paul used other people to write down. There's one letter where he mentions the person who wrote down his letter for him. Even though he could write, sometimes you just had somebody else do the tedious work for you. And so the fact that, it doesn't matter who actually wrote it. The fact is the content is by Ruth. And she was living in a foreign country, and she and her two daughters-in-law, they were all widowed. And so she was going to go back to her ancestral home in Israel. She was living in Moab, I think it was. And halfway there, she's like, you know what, you girls, go back to your own people. You're not, this is just my issue. I will go back there and die alone and broke. And one of the girls turned back, but the other came with her. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Naomi, her mother. Ruth is the daughter that went with her, that decided to be loyal to her and go with her to Israel. Naomi was the woman with the two daughters-in-law, and Ruth is the daughter-in-law that went with her. And it turns out that this Ruth was very bold in and providing for Naomi, actually. They got back there, and Ruth went out to the fields to glean. And what they did in that culture was that after a field the workers had gone through the field and collected the crops, the poor would go through and pick off what they missed. And so Ruth was going out to try to, gather food for her and her mother-in-law. And she found out that the owner of the field was a distant relative, in that culture called a kinsman redeemer. That is to say that he was the nearest male relative, and it was ultimately going to be his responsibility to take care of Ruth and Naomi, or at least Naomi. Ruth was not a blood relative yet. Well, she was never going to be, but she was not a relative. She was going to be. But they didn't know that at the time. And so when they found out that they were related, Ruth actually let herself into where the owner was sleeping at night, and he woke up to find her there. And that was like boldly saying, hey, you have to marry me because we're, you know, you have to continue the family line.
Wow.
That was bold, especially in that culture. And so eventually, you know, she got her, you know, he realized that this is what his obligation was, and he married her, and they were in the line of King David, you know, ancestors, and so also in the line of Jesus. So there was this Ruth, this very bold woman, self-sustaining, taking care of her mother-in-law, and just exemplary character all around, and she wasn't afraid to do what had to be done. So that's who Ruth was. There's another one I'm going to skip for now and go on to Esther, the other famous name in the Old Testament, another who has a book named after her. There's a book of Esther, and she was in exile in Babylon. I think it was Babylon, pretty sure. And she didn't have any parents, apparently. She was an orphan, but she had an uncle named Mordecai who was kind of watching over her. But the king, his wife defied him, and so he threw her out, and so he had a beauty contest to replace her. Like, he didn't have enough wives and concubines already, but you know how it goes. But so she was chosen. She was very beautiful, and she was added to his harem. But there was a head, one of the high government officials there named Haman, who hated the Jews and wanted to wipe them out. And so he tricked the king into signing a decree so that the Jews could be hunted down and killed. And he didn't know that Esther was a Jew. So when they found out what was going on, Esther talked to her uncle Mordecai, who says, look, you are in a position to stop this. You've got to take your life in your hands and go to the king and tell him what's going on. Because in those days, if you approached the king and he didn't raise his scepter to allow you in, he could have you killed on the spot. So she had to be very brave, and she was very patient about it too. She approached him numerous times to kind of lead up to getting him to understand what was really going on, and that this Haman guy was a traitor to the kingdom, actually. And she saved her people and found a way to, I think it was Medo-Persia, actually, not Babylon, but Medo-Persia, the next kingdom after that. And that is why, to this day, the Jews celebrate a holiday called Purim, because they were commemorating what brave Esther did for them to save their people from extinction. And of course, there's many more, and there's some New Testament ones that I'll get into. I'm just going to list here, but I might stop for a second and see if anybody has a question before I go on. Any thoughts, comments on any of this stuff? I know I've been running through it fast, but I really mostly wanted to talk about the New Testament. That was my intro. Almost an hour. Oh my goodness.
Well, it's a lot of information. It's interesting seeing how much I've never seen of what you just talked about.
Yeah, and like I said, all those years of Sunday school, you're not going to hear any of this stuff, and not much about it if you hear it. And the bravery and industry and loyalty and all the qualities of these women are glossed over. And if I sound funny, it's because I just popped a mint in my mouth because my mouth got very dry, but I didn't want to go get a drink. I'm too lazy. I had a mint right here, so I use that. But yeah, all these women, and just in the Old Testament. And so this isn't a matter of theology here. This is history. And
right.
This, it's hard to argue with these examples. And there's so many of them. And we haven't even talked, I do want to talk about one more, of course, that being Eve. People never stop to ask why it is that God promised the Redeemer through Eve alone. I can get into, maybe if I have time, I'll get into that part of my book, but basically in Genesis 3 is where you read about the fall of man. And people all through history have blamed Eve as the first sinner, even though the Bible never does. The Bible lays all sin at the feet of Adam. And people try to make excuses for this by saying, well, Adam was the federal head of the human race. And the Bible doesn't say that either. What it does say, if you look at the text, is that God confronted three entities involved, Adam, Eve, and the serpent, and then made pronouncements to them in reverse order. That's a typical rhetorical device. So this is the way it was written to make a point. And you find the point by looking at where, there's steps leading up to a point and then steps leading back in reverse order. So you know where the point is, where the two steps cross, where they meet in the middle. And that's what's going on in Genesis. First, God says, Adam, what'd you do? And then he says, Eve, what'd you do? And then he says, serpent, what'd you do? And then he says, first of all, he starts with the serpent. It says, because you did this, you're going to crawl on your belly and eat dust for the rest of your life. And I'm going to put enmity or extreme hostility between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. So that's taken by most scholars as a prediction of the Messiah. And as in hindsight, we can see that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. It's also in Isaiah 17, I think. I think I have that right. It's earlier than that. Isaiah 7, where it says, for unto us a son is given, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And there's another passage where God says that to certain persons worried about the future, and they just had a child, and he says, before the child is old enough to know right from wrong, this king you're worried about will be dead. And that's the passage that the New Testament references when it says, a virgin shall conceive. In the Old Testament, that's one of those passages that was changed by the rabbis when they monkeyed with the vow pointing and all that. And they made it deliberately ambiguous, so it could be either a young woman or a virgin. Well, the Septuagint has virgin. I believe the word is Parthenos, from where we get the famous landmark, the Parthenon. And they, in the New Testament, in the Greek, use that same word. So we can see that the Old Testament incident, where in Genesis 3, where God is confronting Adam, Eve, and the serpent, that he promises that the Messiah would come from the woman's seed, meaning born of a virgin. And you got to ask yourself, what nobody does, why? Why was the man written out of it? If he was so important, why would the Savior come from only the woman? I'd say that she was pretty important. I mean, just common sense. If you look at, why did God say that? And he said it to the serpent. He wasn't even talking to Eve or Adam yet. He said this to the serpent, who was cursed for what he did. And he said that she's going to be your undoing. And remember that she was the one the serpent tempted. And so he's basically saying Eve is going to get her revenge on you, through the Messiah, who would have nothing to do with the man. So, but everybody, you can read some nasty quotes from so-called church fathers blaming Eve for everything, and all women for everything that they put on Eve, as if as if all women are going to share the exact same attributes as Eve. But of course, no, men don't have all the attributes of Adam. That's a fallacy called special pleading. Anyway, and then going back in reverse order, God confronts. God doesn't confront, but he talks to Eve and says, he does not say, because you have done this. He's not cursing her. He says, you will turn back to your husband. The Septuagint uses the word apostrophe, which is where we get our English word apostrophe, and it means to turn back. It's a little squiggle that curves backwards. That's why it's called an apostrophe. And that's the word used in the Septuagint in that passage in Genesis 3, where it says, you're going to turn back or turn away to your husband. Well, who's she turning away from? God. He said he's making a prediction, not a command. He's saying, just before that, he says, and this is where Katherine Bushnell exposes bad translation. It normally will say in the Hebrew and all the English translations, it says, I will greatly increase your pain in childbirth. But that's not what it says. It says, a snare has increased your sorrow and sighing. That's what the Septuagint has. It's probably what was in the Paleo-Hebrew. And that's exactly what happened. She was ensnared. She was tricked. She was trapped by the serpent. And because of this, she will have great sorrow and sighing. And the word for sorrow there is the same word that is used later to describe Adam's toil. Same word in the Hebrew or Septuagint. I forget which one. It's the exact same word. So it's not that God is cursing her with pain in childbirth. That's just part of the general curse. But she's still in the Garden of Eden when he's saying these things. And he's saying, you're going to turn back to him, and then he's going to rule over you. Not as a command, but as a prediction. You're going to choose to follow him, and he's going to rule over you. And he never said, because you have done this. Okay? And then last, God turns to Adam and says, because you have done this, cursed is the ground because of you, because you were taken from the ground. And the whole of creation, as the New Testament said, the whole of creation, it groans and suffers, waiting for us to be redeemed, you know? And so all of nature was cursed because of Adam, because Adam was taken from the ground. Eve was not. She was taken from Adam, which, as far as God is concerned and the Bible is concerned, is different. Now, the animals were also taken from the ground. Only Eve was not. And so when God says we have to drive the Adam, the man, the male, out of the garden so he won't eat from the tree of life, he is the only, because he was taken from the ground, he is the only one driven out. God never says they must not eat from the tree of life. He said Adam must not eat from the tree of life. And Eve followed him out, just like God predicted, and then he ruled over her. If he had been ruling over her before in some benevolent manner, he wouldn't have said, then he will rule over you. He would have said, it's going to be worse. And he didn't say that. So there's a lot in that first chapter, and I go into more detail in my book, but that's the gist of it. And so the bottom line I wanted to get out of that is that there's got to be a reason why God chose the woman to remedy the man's sin. And this shouldn't be glossed over. And in fact, when God made her, he said that she would be what in Hebrew is called an ezer kenegdo, which means a strong ally, an equal, someone who comes to your aid. As if, say, you know, a king was in trouble with an army and needed help from a buddy's army, and so he calls them for aid. That's what an ezer is. And in many cases in the Old Testament, God calls himself an ezer. So helper does not mean a subservient, or else they'd have to say God is. And there's one guy mentioned in this article, John Piper. I just saw his name here a second ago. I don't know what happened to it. But anyway, he actually went to the absurd length of saying that since God, whenever God is helping man, he is subservient to man, just to justify making Eve a servant of Adam. That's how bad it is, how much they'll twist it.
Wow.
Yeah. So at any rate, she was made to supply something that Adam lacked. And here she was doing exactly that when God said the Messiah would come from her seed. If that isn't help, I don't know what is. I mean, her seed would redeem all of mankind, all of Adam and Eve's descendants, from what Adam did, that's truly an easer. So that's what God meant when he said, I will make an easer for him. I will make a helper, someone to supply what he lacked, someone to save him, basically. She was, through her, God would save the human race. So Adam made it go bad, and Eve eventually made it go good through her seed, because no man had anything to do with the birth of Christ. And that, you know, like I said, I'm only touching the surface here, and we've still only covered the Old Testament in an hour of all these exceptions to the alleged rule. And to think that in the New Testament, things would get worse for women is pretty big stretch, if you ask me. So, New Testament. One person at, let me see, I thought I had some in Acts, besides the daughters of Philip. I'm going to try to kind of go in order. And I could look these up, but I think I'll just mention them unless you want to see the passage. Romans 16:7, letter to the Romans by Paul. He mentions in actually the first two verses of Romans, he's doing his final, you know, say hi to everybody kind of thing, the way he signed off most of his letters. He writes about someone named Phoebe. And he calls her a deacon in a church and a benefactor, which the word is prosthesis. And that, if you look up that word, it means someone who stands before others. That is to say, someone who stands in the gap, someone who represents a group. That's what she's called, and in the Greek. She's also called a deacon, and it's the masculine form of the word. There was no feminine form of diakonos in the first century. It took, I think, almost to the Middle Ages before such a form it even existed. So she is called the male form of the word deacon, even though it's clearly a female name, Romans 16:1 and 2. And she is the person that Paul had take his letter to the Romans. And the person who did that, the courier, was not just a delivery person. And besides, if they wanted to just a delivery person, any guy could have done. I mean, you know, guys delivered things all the time. But he said her as his, because she was more than delivering this. She was representing him. He told the people at Rome to receive her as they would receive him and do anything she needed. She was supposed to read and explain, that is, comment on the letter to the people of Rome. That's what Paul was saying and using these terms about her. And so there we have a female deacon and leader of a, standing in front of many groups of people that Paul describes her as, which they weakly translate as benefactor in English. And that she had done this for him. They may make her out to be a helper in English. The King James uses the word succorer. But to succor someone was to help them, to give them aid. And they're trying to make her sound like a nurse or something, but she wasn't. Paul had a physician, Dr. Luke, the writer of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. That was his nurse person, you know. Phoebe was a benefactor, a leader, and a deacon in the church at some place called Centrae, or however you pronounce that. That's Romans 16:1 and 2, and that's what a prominent person she was. And this is the Apostle Paul, who people always cite as some kind of male supremacist, and it's not true at all. Another one in that same chapter, verse 7, is Junia, who is called outstanding among the apostles. And, I guess I'm sitting here showing you only this page. I'm going to go ahead and change that reference. Hold on a second here. Oh, let's click on the right tab and go to the text. We're going to look at, I'm going to go to the Greek interlinear here for this one. Go to Romans 16. This is my Bible site, by the way. I will try to put a link for those things in the description later. Let's widen that just a little bit. I am commending to you our sister Phoebe, an attendant. I used the word attendant in here because that's the primary meaning of the Greek word diakonon, sorry, that's the masculine singular. And she is the attendant or servant or pastor, you could say, of the church in this location, Centria. Accept her from the master, which is the word kurios or Lord. Curio is the root word. And accept her from the master in a manner worthy of the holy ones, and stand by her in whatever she may need, for she became a presiding officer over many, including me. That's that word presiding, prostasis. And keep in mind, in this dictionary I made, this word has to work in every context. I didn't bend the meaning to fit this context. Okay? That's what the word means from the standard dictionaries, and that's how Paul describes this woman, Phoebe. Okay? And then down to verse 7, go back a little bit. I only have 5 verses at a time here. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives and co-captives, they were all in prison, who are noteworthy among the ambassadors, which is apostles, and who were united with the anointed before me. In other words, they were Christians before Paul was. They are a husband and wife or brother and sister. And the name is Junia. The name Junius, masculine, is non-existent in ancient literature, while Junia occurs hundreds of times. Early writers such as Origen, Jerome, and Chrysostom all held Junia to be a woman and an apostle like the others in the New Testament. So, and Chrysostom and these others that he mentioned are very early Christian writers who had every reason and were, in fact, in most cases, misogynistic or at least male supremacist, and yet they conceded that Junia was an outstanding apostle. And this is where I've mentioned elsewhere that there's a committee called the United Bible Societies that are supposedly guardians of the integrity of the biblical original language text. And they decided a long time ago that the idea of a woman apostle was unacceptable, and they broke their own rules in changing it to a masculine form that had no representation in the first century when the New Testament was written. By their own rules, they were supposed to have attestation, meaning they had to find documents and support for whatever meaning they would assign to a word. They didn't have any for this, but they did it anyway. And for 50 years, at least, every translation in every language was misrepresenting her name. They did essentially a gender bender on her by turning her into a man. And then later, after too many eyes were seeing this error, they quietly changed it back again, breaking their rules and never acknowledging what they had done. So for 50 years worth of translations, and some of them still to this day will at least put in the footnotes or Junius, a man, which is complete hogwash. One
thing that's interesting is that Andronicus and Junius, his relatives, who have been in prison with him. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that women were in prison as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even in Acts, where it talks about Saul, this Paul before he was saved was called Saul, and that he went around gathering up both men and women and throwing them in prison.
So it was a co-ed prison, and instead of having it separated, it was co-ed?
Well, I don't know if they were in the same cells. I don't know that.
Okay.
But they were in prison.
Because with me would imply that he interacted with her.
Yeah, it's difficult to say from the text whether he meant physically there right with him or with him in prison, just in prison in general. I'm not sure. I can't get that much detail. But point being, yes, they did imprison women. Which I'll take a little side trip here to Hebrews. Nobody knows who wrote Hebrews, but there's, let me take a quick look at my commentary. I'm going to open that in another tab. Come on, open link a new tab. Let me get rid of these. I must have said new window. I didn't mean to do that. Hold on a second. Let me go get that, because you won't see it if it doesn't appear in this window I'm sharing. Oh, see, now I lost my train of thought. What was I looking for? I hate it when that happens. Oh, Hebrews.
The sidetrack. Okay.
Yeah, Hebrews. Written between 49 and 70 AD, and it's the only letter that mentions Timothy in prison, which could weigh toward its having been written after the death of Paul. A lot of people think Paul wrote Hebrews, but he didn't. But there's at least one other reason to reject Pauline authorship. One verse states that the authors, and it uses plural there, use the pronoun we, had not heard Jesus personally, which Paul did. And Paul always signed his letters, and he had no reason to hide his identity, and it would have been out of character for him to do so. So the fact that no author is listed kind of rules out Paul. It has the most sophisticated Greek of all the letters, but its author remains a mystery. In fact, there seems to have been a deliberate hiding of the author's identity. Luther suggested, Martin Luther that is, suggested it was Apollos, someone we meet in the New Testament, who incidentally was trained by a husband and wife team. And later research has suggested Apollos' teacher Priscilla, also called Prisca. That was Priscilla is actually the nickname, but that's a woman, and possibly her along with her husband Aquila. Priscilla had been mentioned by Paul as a co-worker, and female authorship would explain the omission of the author's name, as it would not only have gone against the social norms at the time, but also could result in the woman's torture and death at the hands of the Roman government. She, her husband, and Timothy had all worked together with Paul. There's only one spot in the entire letter that is cited as proof that the author must have been a male. In 1132, the pronoun me goes with the verb to relate, and that verb is a grammatical masculine. And on that flimsy basis, so many people say, it was a man. One pronoun. And the only reason the pronoun is masculine is because the verb to relate is masculine. So I'm equally positive that had this been a feminine word, that and they had a feminine pronoun, that no one would say, well, that proves that a woman wrote it. So there you go. At any rate, it ignores, let's see, all the forms of the word have no grammatical gender. Another candidate is Barnabas, who was a Levite and highly trained, but no reason to hide his identity. And the first scholarly argument for Priscilla's possible authorship was done by the German scholar Adolf von Harnack in 1900. Okay, so a man in the 1900s Germany who was certainly not looking for a woman author of Hebrews, and here's the reference of the work in which he wrote that. So we have pretty good reasons, and that God's Word to Women site goes into more detail about why Hebrews was probably written by women, and the most likely candidate was Priscilla. So, anyway, I forget what sent me on that, but
Romans being in prison with him.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so women were imprisoned, and one of the reasons that this was probably one of the reasons why a woman as author of Hebrews would not have been named. They don't want to get her in any trouble. And then here in verse, I was already there at verse 7, where we have Junia the apostle. I think in my commentary on Romans, let me go back there. Let me look up. These are the lame excuses that people have come up with to say, no, that couldn't be. The first one was that Junia was a man, the gender bender I mentioned. It was the Middle Ages. That was the first time anybody tried to make up a male version of her name. The next excuse, since that didn't hold water, was that she was not an apostle herself, but merely known to them. That is to say, the apostles knew her well. And that is really lame as well, because everybody knows that if this were, in fact, a man's name, and why else did they try that first? they would not say that this guy was just known to them. And the grammatical indicators there seem pretty clear that this person was counted among them, not simply known by them. Those are different words. So she was definitely among them. And then they decided, okay, it's a woman and she was among them, but she didn't have any authority. She was like a lesser grade of apostle, which is preposterous. There isn't any apostle in the entire Bible, in the entire New Testament, that is graded by any reason at all. There are no different kinds of apostles. You either are or you aren't. And that word apostle means sent out. And what's important is not who is sent out, but by whom. So we have taken the word apostle to mean kind of a specialized word that it didn't used to have in the first century, a specialized meaning, because our modern equivalent is pretty much missionary. Okay, an apostle was a missionary. And the thing is that the original apostles were sent out by Jesus himself directly. Paul was also sent out by Jesus himself directly, although later, after Jesus had risen from the dead and all that, he appeared to Paul later. And Paul even says, I'm like the last person in a line of prisoners being dragged through the city, to be mocked. I'm the least of all the apostles. If there's any kind of hierarchy in apostles, Paul put himself at the bottom. But there's no hierarchy in that regard. I mean, you were sent out by God or you weren't. And so to call her an apostle and then say, well, she didn't have any authority, and that's what really bugs these people, is a woman having authority. This just grasping at straws. That's all it is. It's desperation. So let me see what my footnote was here. Okay, there's a guy named Epp who wrote a book called Junia, the First Woman Apostle, back in 2005, recommended book, where he explains all these detail in a lot more than I'm saying here. So Paul himself is listing these women and very highly, and those certainly weren't the only women in that chapter that he mentioned. Let's go back to the English text for Romans and go to chapter 16. The very last here. There's a lot of women in this list. He's got Priscilla again, Phoebe, Priscilla, Junia. Let's see. I know there's more in here. Tryphena and Tryphosa, who are probably twins, women who labored for the Lord, the Master. And then some more names, brothers and sisters, because the Greek word is not gender specific. Most cases, the King James has men when it doesn't say the Greek word for man or males. It says the Greek word for people, from where we get the word anthropology, anthropos. It just means people. And so brothers and sisters, or when even the Greek word brothers, adelphos, from where we get, Philadelphia is brotherly love. Adelphos was an inclusive term. In Greek, if you wanted to specify what kind of people were in a group, the male term was used unless there were no males, and then the female term was used. So in other words, there could be a mixed group, a group of all men or a mixed group had one word used, and a group of all women had another word used. And this group is inclusive for mixed or male. So when it says adelphos, it means brothers and sisters, unless it's clear from the context that it's one or the other. One, either just brothers or brothers and sisters. So if we don't know in this context, it's all good and proper to say brothers and sisters. There's another one, Julia, another unnamed sister. Let's see, there was another one where he was asking two women to stop fighting. I forget where that was, but they were women. And the only reason they would be of any concern that they were fighting is because they were church leaders. Otherwise, who would care? Why would anybody need to write to Paul about it? Let's see now. Don't want to forget anything. That's Romans. Priscilla, we've met before in the book of Acts, who co-taught Apollos, and they ran a business together. There's also a woman named Lydia in the New Testament. But now she was a businesswoman as well. The Apostle Paul at one point in Acts went to the city where she lived, and he went down to the river looking to where the women were meeting, and found her there, and she listened to his message and was converted to Christianity, and then she invited everyone into her home. She was a woman of means, and the Christians met in her home. And Christians met in the home of the person who was leading the group, pretty much. So there's that. But now, for the last part of this, I think what I want to do is go through all the passages that are typically used either one way or the other in these debates. And then I'll try and wrap that up because we're going on an hour and a half now. Okay. Is that okay? You got any questions or anything before I do that?
No, I'm good.
Alrighty. I'm just going to go through these quickly here. Matthew 1:23. Okay, this is the one I was talking about earlier. The unmarried woman will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will give him the name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Unmarried is what the Greek word means, not strictly virgin, and not necessarily a woman, but of course obvious here that the woman is meant. But this context clearly indicates that Mary's pregnancy was caused by the Holy Spirit, so there's no reason to render the word inaccurately in order to preserve the teaching of the virgin birth. The point is that Jesus had no human father. In other words, the Greek word also just means a young woman, but it also meant virgin. That was part of the semantic range of that word. So you get it from the context, and the context is clear that there was no human male involved here. So it's all proper to transfer the New Testament writer Matthew to translate the Old Testament reference as virgin. But you know, the word could go either way, but it's not wrong to translate it as virgin. I chose the more generic meaning here, not to downplay the virgin birth at all, because it's clear from the context, but just for accuracy's sake. Let's see, the next reference would be 9:20. And in there we see about the beginning of an incident where Jesus is walking along, and he was coming to help a woman whose daughter had or a guy, I think it was a man, a ruler, a man whose daughter had just died, and he was seeing if Jesus could do anything about this. And on the way there, he stopped by another woman, and it says she had been hemorrhaging for 12 years and came up behind him and touched the hem of his cloak, because she had thought to herself, if only I touch his clothing, I will be restored or healed. I'm just being super technical there. Then Jesus turned around and saw her, and he said to her, "Cheer up, daughter, your faith has restored you," or healed you. The word is actually, I think, if I remember correctly, is the word soteros, which is where we get the word salvation. It doesn't always mean salvation from sin. It means rescue, restoration, all sorts of things. It depends on the context. And so he's saying that her health has been restored here. So this is an incident of a woman who boldly went up to Jesus and touched the hem of his cloak without asking anybody's permission, and he did not rebuke her. He said her faith had healed her. Okay, 15:22. Whoops, I went past it. There was a Canaanite woman, that is to say a non-Jew, she was a foreigner from around there, and she shouted out, "Have pity on me, sir, descendant of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But he did not respond to her, so his disciples went up to him and said, "Dismiss her, because she's shouting at us." In other words, they couldn't be bothered with this woman who's had the demon-possessed daughter. And then Jesus said to her, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel." In other words, Jesus was just focused on his mission, you know, but she argued with him, okay? She says, "Sir, please help me anyway." And Jesus said back, "We shouldn't take the children's food and toss it to the puppies." He's not calling her a dog. He's just using an illustration from common life that it isn't right to give the main meal to the pets in the house. In other words, he's there to focus on Israel. The rest of the Gentiles would be taken care of later, but so why should he give the children's food, that is to say, what he came to give to Israel, to a Gentile? That's all he's saying here. And she says, yes, that's true, but the puppies do get the scraps that fall from their master's table. So she's arguing with Jesus, and she wins, because he says, dear lady, you have great faith. What you wanted will happen. And her daughter was healed that very hour. She argued with Jesus and won. This foreign woman that the disciples were trying to shoo away, and she was persistent and argued with him on the basis of his philosophical statement that about throwing the children's food to the dogs, and she said, well, they at least get the crumbs. So I thought that was clever of her, and he did not rebuke her at all, and she argued with him and won, unlike a lot of the men in the scriptures. So
yeah.
Let's see, 26:7. This is all just Matthew. But I do like to be thorough. Let's see, 26, we're almost there. All right. A woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive perfumed oil, and she poured it on his head as he reclined for dinner. The disciples were indignant and said, what a waste. This could have been sold for a lot of money and the proceeds given to the destitute. But when Jesus realized this, he scolded them and said, why are you giving this woman such grief? She is doing an honorable thing to me. You will always have the destitute with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring the perfumed oil on me, she was anointing my body for burial. And I assure you that wherever the gospel is proclaimed around the world, what she did will be spoken of in her memory. So here again, the disciples, and not just the disciples, but he was in the house of a Pharisee, I believe, at this. No, actually, that's a different incident. Simon the leper, whatever, why was he in the home of a leper? Maybe he had been cured, who knows, but it doesn't say. Anyway, she had come to anoint him and pour oil on him, and this turns out to have been Mary Magdalene. In another passage, it explains who this was, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 demons. So she is eternally grateful, and she's, crying and pouring oil on his feet and just, in total gratitude. And all they could think about was the cost of the perfumed oil. It was extremely expensive, like a year's wages this stuff was. And to get it out, you had to break the pottery jar and use it all. And so they were saying how wasteful this was. That's all they could think about. And he rebuked them and said, what she did will always be remembered. And it usually is, even in spite of the fact of all that gets downplayed. Every Christmas story, Easter story, they will talk about that this woman anointed Jesus for burial. So that's another instance of how Jesus treated women. 27:55. Oops. All right. This is at his crucifixion, and it says, there were many women watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and attended to his needs. Among them were Mary of Magdala, which is Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, 2 of the apostles, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Zebedee's sons were James and John. And this is the mother who was in a couple of other incidents, and I don't know if I wrote those down, where even at the Last Supper, and I think if I go back here, and I got to remember there's one more reference I want to look at. Let me look for, let's see, what's a keyword I can look for on here. See, Grant. Here we are, back in chapter 20. Jesus was approached by the mother of Zebedee's sons, who brought them to him and knelt down before him to ask him something. What is it you want? Asked Jesus. Grant that these 2 sons of mine will sit beside you in your kingdom, one at the right and one at the left, she said. And another account has it just them asking him directly. They wrote her out of the story. Neither of you realize what you're asking, Jesus said. And they said, yeah, we know what we're in for. And he says, but those places are not up to me. And then he says, then the account goes on, when the other 10 disciples heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. So Jesus called them all to himself and said, and I was going to give them a lesson out of this. Says, you know that the rulers of the nations exercise mastery over their people, and their high officials wield authority over them. but it must not be this way among you. For whoever wants to be in charge of you must become your servant, and whoever wants to be the most prominent among you must be your slave. After all, the human, which is usually translated the Son of Man, a term Jesus used for himself, did not come to be waited on, but to be the waiter and to give his life as a ransom payment for many. So Jesus is giving this object lesson and saying that humility is how it's going to be in his kingdom. It's going to be upside down from the world. And that was the illustration he gave when he at the Last Supper, when he washed his disciples' feet. He turned authority on its head. He showed by example what a leader was to be in his kingdom. The most humble person who gets under people to lift them up. And that's the meaning of the Greek word that is typically translated authority or something like that. And it's hupotasso is the one I'm thinking of, and it's where you get under someone in order to lift them up. That's what Jesus is talking about, and he modeled it, and he's rebuking his power-tripping disciples here, and I go into more of that in my other video on hierarchy. But these are the two sons, and of the mother that was just mentioned among the ladies who were brave enough to stick with Jesus to the end, whereas all the men had left except John the disciple, the so-called beloved disciple. He was the only one that stuck around of the men. But a lot of these women stayed. Let's see, where was I? I was back in 2755 is where I was. Whoops, went past it again. Let's see. Yeah, there were many women watching, and one of them was the mother of Zebedee's sons. So this woman who once had wanted positions of authority for her sons, and who said that they were willing to pay the price, was there to witness what the price was going to be. So that's important to note that she was there. And the last thing in Matthew 28:4, the guards, lead this whole paragraph. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the grave, and suddenly there was a tremendous earthquake because the messenger or angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and he rolled away the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. The guards shook with fear and passed out. The messenger said to the women, "Don't be afraid." So the women are not passed out, but the Roman soldiers are. I just think that's funny, and nobody talks about that. And that's what this footnote is about. So they shook with fear to the point of passing out, these tough Roman soldiers, and the women kept their wits about them and were merely afraid. So, and they were the first people who went out. They were the first to see Jesus alive after his death and resurrection, and they went to tell the disciples. They were the first evangelists. They were telling the good news. Yes, they were preaching the gospel. That's exactly what they were doing. They were telling people the good news that Jesus rose from the dead, and that is the gospel, and that is preaching. Preaching is proclaiming, and gospel means good news. So they were proclaiming good news. That's preaching the gospel, and that's what these women did, and they were the first to do it, and they were evangelizing the disciples. And of course, that gets glossed over. And that's just one of the Gospels. There's only a few in the others because mostly they're the same material. Let's see, Mark 15:40. Let me get rid of this search box and go down to 15. Mark is a pretty short Gospel. You can imagine how much fun I had making these. Let's see, 15:40. This is about the crucifixion as well. There were also women there watching from a distance, and there's some other women as well, some more names. These were the ones who had followed Jesus in Galilee and provided for his needs. They were his benefactors. They took care of Jesus. They provided from their own money what he needed. And there were many others who accompanied him to Jerusalem. So there were a lot of women around. They just didn't, most of the time, didn't get their names mentioned. Let's see, Luke 10:38. Oops. After they left, Jesus entered a village where a certain woman named Martha, this is Mary and Martha, if anybody's familiar with the Bible stories, welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary. This is not Mary Magdalene, it's another Mary. I'm pretty sure it's not Mary Magdalene, who sat at the master's feet. These were the sisters of Lazarus, who was famously raised from the dead by Jesus later on. And anyway, Mary, Martha's sister, sat at his feet and listened to what he was saying. And let me check my footnote here. It says, Mary was doing what any student of a rabbi would do, and I've read this in several sources. And for a lone woman to do this was quite scandalous. It's possible that Martha was really more upset with this than with needing help in the kitchen, because what it says here is that Martha was distracted by all the meal prep, so she said, Master, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve all alone? Tell her to get busy and help me. It is to say, she belongs in the kitchen with me. And Jesus said, Martha, Martha, you're distracted and frazzled about all these things, but only one thing really matters. Mary has chosen the good part and will not be taken from her. So Jesus is teaching Mary. You don't sit at someone's feet unless you're learning from a rabbi, and the purpose of the student is to be like the master. So she was being trained. Martha was more, in the culture and seeing it only from cultural eyes and saying, hey, she shouldn't be doing that. Tell her to get in the kitchen and help me. And Jesus says, nah, she can sit here and listen to me. Once again.
So very clearly, Jesus was not saying, woman, you belong in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Yay.
Yeah. I mean, he's telling her, don't stop her. You're worried about all this stuff. You shouldn't be working so hard in the kitchen anyway, but let her sit here and listen to me. He did not rebuke Mary for sitting and listening to him, and instead of helping in the kitchen. This is Jesus, and this is how he treated women. Okay. That was, what did I look up here? Luke 10. I am in Luke, right? I think so, yeah. 10:38 and 24:9. I will get there any minute now. Oops. There we are. So the woman returned from the tomb after the crucifixion and the resurrection, announced all these things to the 11. So here again, they went to tell them the gospel, and everyone else. Those who told these things to the ambassadors or apostles were Mary of Magdala, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and their companions. But they, the disciples, dismissed it all as nonsense and didn't believe them. Nevertheless, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. He went over to look inside, and seeing only bandages there, he went away, wondering what could have happened. Another account has also that the apostle John went along with him and got there first. He outran Peter. But he didn't go in. He just looked inside, where Peter just went right past and barged into the tomb. At any rate, the point here is that the disciples didn't believe the women. And later on, let's see. There was Jesus after his resurrection and everything. One of these accounts, he said he rebuked them for their disbelief. Anyway, I think it must be one of the other Gospels where he actually said he rebuked them for not believing the message of the women. So, once again, Jesus stands up for the women. And John chapter 4 and 8. Let's see, John chapter 4. Whoops. John is a very long book, so I tend to scroll past it too fast. Let me go back here. Okay. Okay, this is where Jesus is going through Samaria. Samaria was a hated place, the hated people by the Jews because they were half-breed Jews. And he had to travel through there. And he came to one of their cities called Sychar, near the parcel of land Jacob had given to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well were there. And Jesus, tired from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. A woman comes out of Samaria to draw water. And Jesus says to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone into the city to buy food. So she says to him, "What's with a Judean like you asking a Samaritan woman like me for a drink? Because Judeans don't associate with Samaritans." And Jesus answered, "If you only knew the gift of God and who's asking you, then he would give you living water." And she's like, "What? You don't even have a bucket? How are you going to get water?" And Jesus says, everyone who drinks this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks the water I give will not thirst again. And she's like, well, give me some. And Jesus says, go get your husband and come back here. And she says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, well said. You've had 5 men, and the one you have now isn't your husband. Your statement is quite true. He's not rebuking her. He's not getting nasty. He's not calling her a sinner. He's not saying that she should be taken out and stoned. He's just saying, I know more things than I should know about you. He's proving who he is.
Right.
And I've heard, I can't remember where I saw it, where somebody explained that no, she wasn't coming out at noon because she was shamed by the other women. There were other reasons for her to come out then, and it wasn't because she was in, some bad, reputation or anything. But still, he knew what was going on with her. And it doesn't say she was promiscuous. It just said she had 5 men. It doesn't, that the current one was not actually her husband. So whatever you want to read into that, but people read too much. And she says, sir, I can tell you're a prophet. Okay, so she's on to the fact of what he's saying now. He's been talking about living water and she didn't understand, but now she understands. So that what he said, by telling her stuff that nobody else knew about it, that he couldn't possibly have known, she knew that he was some kind of spiritual guy. And she says, I got a question for you. Our ancestors worshipped in this mountain, but you Judeans say that only Jerusalem is the place to worship. And Jesus gives her, this woman of all people, the blueprint for the coming church. He says, the time is coming when none of you will worship the Father in this mountain or in Jerusalem. Your people worship in ignorance, but we worship in understanding, because the rescue, that is the salvation that the Jews were looking for, that is to say him, comes from the Judeans, meaning the people of Judea, the Jews at that time. The word is Judean in Greek. That's how I rendered it. Yet the time is coming, in fact, it's already upon us, when real worshipers will worship the Father genuinely and spiritually, since they are the kind the Father searches for. God is spirit, and those who worship him must do so genuinely and spiritually. And so he's talking about the fact that there won't be a special sacred place to go to worship God. He's saying it will be spiritual and not just external performances. And so he's telling this to her for the first time that he told anybody. And she says, I understand that the anointed, that is to say the Christ, is coming. And even here in this passage, you can see they translated in the passage. She used the word anointed, in Greek, or in Hebrew, it's Messiah. In Greek, it's Christ. And if you look at the Greek text, and we can look at that if you want, but I don't want to take the time right now, the writer is translating for the reader. So this is telling me, and it's one of those indications to tell me, yes, it was written in Greek originally. Some people say it was Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that. But I'm saying, look, they're speaking in Aramaic, she and Jesus, most likely. And so this fact that this person is translating right here in the text is saying this is a Greek writer. Anyway, and when he comes, he will explain everything completely. And Jesus says, you're looking at him. And then his disciples come and they're like, why is he talking to a woman? But they didn't say anything to him. And then she went off, left her water jar there, went into the city to tell everybody, come and see someone who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ, the anointed, the Messiah? So they left the city. And then they said, he talks to them. And then they said, now many of the Samaritans of that city put their trust in him, their faith in him, because of what the woman said when she testified. He told me everything I ever did. So she got them all to believe he was the Messiah. She was an evangelist. She was spreading the gospel. And Jesus told her how things were going to be from now on. And so here we have a woman spreading the good news all over town. She's had 5 men. She's living with a man she's not married to. And Jesus doesn't say one word of rebuke. And he gives her this special announcement. And she passes it on. And there are people, organizations today, a growing movement, that would say that Jesus should probably not have done this. This is essentially what they're saying when they're telling Christian women not to do these things. And that's what they're telling them. And it just burns me up. So anyway.
So they have their own agenda, and they're going against what the Bible says and the example that Jesus was.
Exactly. We had all that stuff in the Old Testament, and now here's Jesus continuing and even in improving on the plight of women, and the treating them as absolute equals. And this, again, is not a matter of theology. I'm not, philosophizing about this stuff. I'm just reading it. So, oh, did you drop out for a second?
Did.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay.
So anyway, so far we haven't even got to the controversial stuff. This is just reading the text. And let's see, one more thing here in the Gospels. Go down to chapter 8. The woman caught in adultery. Now, the scripture scholars, which is to say the scribes and Pharisees, bring a woman caught in the act of adultery and standing her among them. They asked Jesus, "Teacher, this woman is caught in the act of adultery. Yet the laws of Moses say that such people are put to death by stoning. What do you say?" They're trying to trap him. And the one thing that isn't mentioned that he easily could have mentioned is the fact that he should have said, "Where's the man?" Because the Old Testament specifies both of them were to be put to death by stoning, both the man and the woman. And they just brought the woman. And some people speculate that the reason they didn't bring the man is because he was one of them, their own Pharisee people. But anyway, they only did this. They probably set her up. How else do you catch somebody in the act? And so they brought her alone just to see what Jesus would do. They thought they would have him trapped, as they've done many times before, trying to think they have him trapped to where no matter what he answers, they have something to pin on him. So he says, they say, "There's what the law says. What do you say? Are you going to listen to Moses or not?" And then, the writer here says, of course, they only said this to test him, so they would have something to charge him with. So Jesus stooped down and wrote something in the dirt with his finger. Doesn't say what. Since they kept on demanding an answer, he stood up and replied, "Let the sinless one among you throw the first stone." And everybody's heard this phrase, that he was without sin cast the first stone. That's the Middle English King James rendering of it. So he's kind of writing in the dirt just to kind of go, yada, 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 you guys shut up. He's ignoring them. And then they won't let him alone. So he stands up and says, "Okay, the most sinless one among you throw the first stone." And he stooped down to write some more on the ground, and those listening went away one by one, beginning with the elders. He was left alone with the woman. And what does he do then? He stands up, he says, "Where are they? Notice no one condemning you?" And she says, "No one, sir." And he says, "Neither do I. Go your way, but from now on you must stop failing." Failing is the particular, I'm rendering there's different Greek words for sin. By the first century, they pretty much meant all the same thing, but I want to render each word differently in English just to show you that there was a different word. Excuse me. And he says, he's letting her off, but he says, "Go and sin no more." This is the part a lot of people miss. They say, well, Jesus doesn't care about sin anymore. No, he does. He says, "Don't do it anymore." And she's not the only one he would say this to. There was another incident where he heals somebody who had been stricken because he was sinning, and he says, "Stop sinning. I'm healing you, but stop." Okay? So he's not saying she should have been committing adultery, but he's saying, you were set up, you were framed, I'm letting you go, but don't do it anymore. This is once again how he treats women. So throughout the Gospels, nobody can show where women were treated as second class by Jesus or ignored in a way that he would not also ignore a man in the same situation. He didn't treat them as subhuman at all. And in fact, they were honored in many cases. They were shown to be more brave. This is one of those reasons why I think the Bible could not have been written by anyone but God, because even the best disciples of that day are being portrayed as cowardly, thick, dense, all sorts of less than exemplary qualities. And the women aren't treated that way in the New Testament. They just aren't in the Gospels. So. And we still haven't got to any theology yet. That was all, and even Acts, which the book of Acts, which is the Acts of the Apostles, which is the earliest history of the New Testament, written by the gospel writer of Luke. Luke was a physician and the personal physician of Paul as he traveled. And we can tell this by the book of Acts. Even secular historians will concede that Luke was a first-rate historian. He was very good at writing a history according to the standards of his time. And he starts it off by saying he's writing to this guy, Theophilus, who was probably a benefactor of some sort. He says, the first account I made, meaning the Gospel of Luke, covered virtually everything that Jesus did and taught right up to the day he was taken up. That is to say, he went to heaven. And then he talks about who he interviewed. And then he quotes Jesus' last instructions. And then he gives a few, a little prophecy there. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear this background noise. Is that drowning anything out? There's some noise I can't control here. Some speaking. Okay, I don't think it's so bad.
I'm not hearing anything background.
Okay, good. At any rate, he went up to heaven, hidden by a cloud from their sight, and this is how Luke begins his gospel, or not gospel, but his historical account of the early church. And then eventually, instead of talking in the third person, he begins to say we and us. So that's a point at which Luke joins Paul in his travels. So this is a good historical account, and he gives names and dates and rulers and places and weather and all sorts of things. So this is a very high quality account. And so in this account, we read, want to check on some things about women here. In Acts 2, 17 and 18, this is where at the event called Pentecost was a Jewish holiday. It was one of the festivals specified by Moses. And there were a lot of people in Jerusalem on this day, of course. They all came to Jerusalem for the festival. And the Holy Spirit had just come on all the apostles. Jesus said, wait here in Jerusalem, don't go anywhere until I send the Holy Spirit. And that's when the Holy Spirit came in great power, and they all spoke in different languages from all the people from all over the region and speaking different languages. That's where you get the idea of speaking in tongues. That means other languages that you don't know. It's a miracle. And so this is going on, and then everybody's confused. And so Peter stands up with the other 11. The 11 was what they were called because Judas had been a traitor and was dead. Eventually they would replace him, but he stands up and says, listen to me, the people, we are not drunk. This is what the prophet Joel was inspired to predict. So he's going to quote the Old Testament, okay? And he says, it will happen in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your youths will have visions, your elders will have dreams. In fact, even on my male and female slaves, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. So even in the Old Testament, it was prophesied that men and women would be treated equally as prophets of God. There it is right there. You can't deny, nobody can deny it. And this is Peter saying it. So there's one reference, and this is, again, not a matter of theology. He's saying prophecy and women twice, and quoting an Old Testament prophet in this process. So there's no debate on this. And what is prophecy? Speaking for God to the people. Thus saith the Lord kind of thing. When God gives somebody a prophetic message, it doesn't matter male or female. The flesh is irrelevant. Let's see. 1350 is the next passage. Let's see. Whoop. I think I'd have better software. I should work on that someday so I can go right to where I'm going. But I always have other things to do. 1350 is what I'm looking for. 50. All right. All right. But again, the Judeans goaded the devout and respected women and city dignitaries into persecuting Paul and Barnabas. Devout and respected women and city dignitaries. So these were Gentiles, but they also had women of prominence. And the Judeans actually cared enough about these women to persuade them to persecute Paul and his traveling buddy Barnabas at the time. So these women existed, and nobody rebuked them for being in power. Okay, another one, 1640. I'll get there eventually. Okay, there's a similar incident. I know there was well, this is not that other incident, but this is where Paul had been imprisoned, and he was released, and they went to Lydia's house. Remember, I talked about Lydia, the seller. She was a seller of purple garments. That was her business, and she was converted when Paul went down to the river to speak to the women. And so they went to her house. It wasn't just because she was their friend. She was the church leader in the area. So they got out of jail and they went there. But the fact is, Lydia's house, not Lydia's husband's house, not Lydia's father's house. Okay?
Interesting. Lydia's
house. What's other thing is interesting, now that just popped into my head, there's this guitar player named Matthias Eklund. Very good guitar player, very wild and crazy guy, and he has a song called Lydia's House. Very good song. But anyway, neither here nor there. I just thought I'd mention that. That was 1638 or 1640, and then 1704 and 1712. I'm always going past it. Okay. Paul's spreading the gospel, and he says some of them were convinced and sided with Paul and Barnabas instead of against them, including a great number of devout Greeks, a significant portion of which were prominent women. Prominent women in Greece. Let's see, what was the other one here? Verse 12. Many came to faith, including respectable Greek women and a significant number of men. So there we have Greek women mentioned again. And we're still in history. Now we're going to get to the more controversial stuff. I better hurry because it's been 2 hours. I didn't want to go too much.
Okay.
Oh, man. And I'm just getting to the really controversial stuff. But I'm glad that I took the time to do this because this is stuff you cannot argue with. I'm just reading the text. You know, you can't say that I'm misinterpreting it. It's right there. And I can show you anybody the Greek who wants to see it. And I can show you in any Greek family that you want to see it. I mean, most people don't even know what I mean by that. But moving right along, 1 Corinthians 1:11, we're going to see something really interesting. All right. People of Corinth, there's a church there that has written to Paul, and he's writing back. So we're listening to half of a conversation, okay? So he's answering their questions, he's addressing issues, and he's with someone named Sosthenes, and he's writing to the congregation in Corinth, and greetings, salutations, I am so happy to have you, and all that stuff. And he says, now to business here. I don't want there to be factions among you. So they had a lot of divisions there, and the problem was there was infighting and squabbling going on. He wants them to unify, but he's got to address the problems. He says, it has come to my attention via some of Chloe's followers. Who is Chloe? Chloe is a female name. Chloe's followers. Note that the woman Chloe is listed as a leader, just as Paul, Apollos, and Peter, called Cephas here in this letter, or Kephas in the Greek. There's nothing expressed or implied about any household, as most translations put it. They add the word Chloe's household. Household is not in any Greek translation. It's just of Chloe, just as they say of Apollos down here, of Apollos or Cephas or Christ here. They're saying that you have Paul is saying you have carved up the anointed into all these pieces. And he's saying in the same list of followers, as these men, he lists this woman, Chloe. This is not her household. And why would anybody care whether it was Chloe's household, and why is it named after her instead of her husband or her father or her brother? So there's two layers of this going on. They're naming the woman as the head of the house by saying it's her house. And they're saying that she's got followers. And these followers are the ones who told him what was going on in Corinth, to whom he is writing his response. So she has told him, her followers have told Paul that there are rivalries among them, and how they say, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, whatever. And then Paul's rebuking them, saying, I was not crucified for you, and you did not use my name when you were baptized. but the point is Chloe's followers, okay? And that's another non-negotiable, non-arguable point. That's what the Greek says. You can only argue on the basis of translations done by people who, as I mentioned before, were not above changing the Bible itself and changing the gender of women just to make sure nobody thinks they had any kind of importance. So this is what the problem is with, yes, a lot of people can be wrong, as we all know, and this is certainly true of the Bible as well, but the truth can be found. It always can. Okay, so that was verse 11. Then we have, getting down to some more controversial stuff in chapter 7. And here we go. And he says, concerning what you wrote. This is a quote. Now, in Greek did not have quote marks. So translators can play fast and loose with this if they want to and not violate any technical rules. But there are little indications in the wording of things that sometimes can tell you the beginning and ending of someone being quoted. Mm-hmm. And especially when it's followed by a rebuttal, which is weakly, as we're going to see, translated or. I'll get to that in a minute. But he's saying, clearly, he's answering their questions that Chloe's followers brought him. He's saying, concerning what you wrote is, and this is what they wrote, it is good for a man not to be intimate with a woman. They're saying, that we shouldn't be doing any of that stuff. And he says, Paul of all people is saying, no, because of the times we live in, sounds familiar, everybody should have, a man should have his own wife and woman should have her own husband. And then he talks about mutual authority over each other, not unilateral authority, not a one-direction authority. He's talking about they each have rights to each other. That's what he's saying here.
As complementing?
Yes. And he says it point blank. He says the wife is not the only one with authority over her body. Her husband has it too. Likewise, the husband does not have exclusive authority to his body, but shares it with his wife. He's being very mutual here. There's even a magazine called Mutuality by that egalitarian organization where they appeal to the many instances in the New Testament of mutual submission. It's not unilateral. Some people, like that John Piper I mentioned, will say submission some to others. But that's directly contradicting what the Bible says. And here's one of the instances where Paul is absolutely clear. It goes in both directions. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, this is interesting, I'm saying this is a concession, not a command. So Paul is being compassionate here and saying, look, here's the ideal thing, but here's the practical thing. And human weakness and all these things. And he's saying, here's what I'm advising. And he says, I would prefer everyone as to be as I am, but each has their own gift from God. One has this, another has that. And then he's going to give advice on widows and things. And I'm not going to get into that now, but on my commentary on this passage, I split this, not split it, but I break it down because I'm saying, hey, look, this is a redundancy here, but so he must be talking about a particular couple. And in one instance, I'm saying that I figured from the text, and this is my interpretation, this is debatable, but it seems clear to me from the text that Paul is talking to a particular woman whose husband is near death. And in that Jewish culture, the rules of Moses were that you had to marry your husband's nearest relative if you didn't have any children, because you had to have heirs to keep it the land and the family. And so a Christian woman would be put in a very bad situation, because it's like, oh, wait a minute, I have to marry my nearest relative, but what if he's not a believer? So there's complicated things, and Paul is trying to figure this stuff out for the first time. And he's saying, well, this is what I think you should do. This is what I think you should not do. In my opinion, she should marry a believer. Don't do the laws of Moses here. He's telling, she's in a very bad position. This will come up later in chapter 11. Not this particular situation, but a very similar one. And I will go over that more. Let's see, this was 7, 1-4. Now we're going to go to chapter 11, some really the more juicy stuff here. Not juicy in the way of what you might think, but controversial. Okay. He says he's going to talk about head coverings. because the people have a question about whether a woman should cover her head. And he introduces the topic. And he's using the word head, his kephali in Greek, and it means literally head, a person's head, an animal's head, the head of something or someone. That's the literal meaning. The figurative meaning would be like the point man in an army. Like if you had an army going up against somebody, there would be somebody at the front, the spearhead. Okay, this person was not necessarily an authority. This person was just the strongest one. You know, I've talked before about what the meaning was of a double-edged sword, and that was the army of the day. Any armies of the day would pick the biggest, strongest guys and give them a double-edged sword, so that their job was to go out first and start slashing left and right into the opposing army to carve out a path so the rest of the army could go through with their regular swords. And so that's what a kephali was. So that's a figurative meaning. It did not mean leader, boss, authority necessarily, because it typically was not the king or the general that did this. It was just the biggest, strongest guy. So he's going to give a statement, opening statement, before he talks about the literal meaning of head, because of head coverings, okay? So he's saying, I want you to understand that the head, and I put it in quotes here because the literal meaning is head, but the word is put in quotes to indicate its metaphorical use, which will be followed by its literal use. The quoted passage is presumed from the context, this is debatable then, my opinion, to be another question from the Corinthians, because otherwise it contradicts what Paul writes in the following paragraphs, okay? So I put in here in parentheses, in brackets, you write, because this is from them. It doesn't make any sense coming from Paul, because what he's going to say next would be a total contradiction of himself if this quoted part was from him. So he's saying, I want you to understand the head of every man is the anointed, the Christ. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of the anointed is God. Look at that order. If Paul was trying to say, here's a pecking order, why did he start with man instead of God? Why did he put the Christ, the Son, before the Father? Seems kind of backwards to me. It's because he's not talking about authority. He's talking about sources. That is another actually primary meaning of, a figurative primary meaning of head was the source of something, the head of a river. We even use that in English. The head of the river is not the boss. It's just where the river starts. So Christ is the head of every man. I mean, so men have a head, a source for, the anointed is the creator, as we can see and go back in Genesis, but one of Paul's other writings where he talks about Jesus as the agent of creation. It's an interesting passage on another topic. But where did the woman come from? She came from the man. He is her source. And Jesus came from God.
So now I see.
Yeah, he's talking about the sources of things, using the metaphorical word for head because not only it meant source, but it would seg into his topic of women's head coverings. Okay. Paul is a writer. He's a good writer. So he's making his case very carefully and building it up, and he starts with this foundation, and he's saying, okay, I'm going to change the topic here because he wasn't talking about that before. He was talking about what people ate and drank, and now he's switching topics, and he's saying, here's the metaphorical use. I'm going to introduce it with this statement. And this is also the beginning of what is called a pericope in Greek, which is like bookends. This is the beginning bookend of a section, and then later he's going to top it off with the same statement. He does that a lot. In Paul's writings, he does that a lot, where he says, we're going to get into that in Ephesians, where he says, husbands, love your wives, blah, 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 blah. Oh, therefore, let husbands love their wives. Okay? Bookends. Here's a bookend right here. This is the start of it. And now he's quoting them and saying, they say, it is disgraceful for any man to pray or prophesy with something on his head, but it is disgraceful for a woman to do so with her head uncovered, because it would be like having her head shaved, because if she doesn't cover, then it must be shaved. And they're going back and forth, and like this is just how they express things. They did a lot of redundancy. It was just a matter of emphasis. And so they're saying, we don't know what to do. We're saying that they think it's disgraceful for a man to pray or prophesy with anything on his head. This is where we get the custom that used to be of men taking their hat off when they went into a church. Okay? It was a cultural thing. And he says, then they say, but it's disgraceful for a woman not to cover her head. Or what are we doing about head covering? So they're saying, well, we think she should cover her head. Okay, that's all they're saying here. They're asking him a question. He says, certainly a man shouldn't cover his head since he represents the dignity or glory of God, is the older word. But it's, what does glory mean? It's his dignity, his honor, his specialness, And yet at the same time, this is a contrary to what was just said. It's not negating this statement, but saying, here's something to consider that balances it. Okay? At the same time, the woman represents the dignity or glory of man. Okay? She is his crowning glory, is what Paul's saying. Eve was the epitome, the thing that Adam rejoiced in when she was first made, and he called her his own flesh and blood. That means that she's talking about what Adam was talking about, what was similar about Eve as opposed to the animals, not what was different about her. That wasn't what Adam was all excited about. He was excited about how the same she was. And Paul is saying that she is his glory, because in the same way that man is the glory of God, that doesn't make man over God, and it doesn't make it is an honoring, though. Okay, so we're being careful how we use this word glory. Okay, and then he says, after all, man's origin is not woman, but woman's origin is man. He's talking about Adam and Eve. Eve came from Adam. And the man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's. Remember what we said about that? Her being an easer, Eve being his easer, and how she helped him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Paul is not belittling the woman here. He's not saying she was made for him, therefore he can use her however he sees fit. He's saying he needed something and lacked something, and she provided it. So for this reason, the woman has the power to decide what to put on her own head. Translations deliberately change that and say she has a sign of authority over her head. That is to say, her covering represents her submission. That is not in the Greek at all. A sign of does not appear in the Greek at all, any Greek text. It just says she has the power to decide what to put on her head. Here's a footnote. The woman's authority is her own per the normal rules of Greek grammar when the possessive pronoun is omitted. So by the grammar, we know that the authority is her own. Okay? So it's up to her. Paul is saying, you guys don't know what to do. Let her decide. It's her head on the line, literally, because the problem was that in that culture, if she didn't cover her head, she could be seen as a rebellious woman and put to death. So they're like, what do we do? And they're saying, and Paul says, it's up to her. It's her head. And then he goes on and makes a curious statement that gets all twisted up. And he says, for this reason, the woman has the power to decide what to put on her own head for the sake of the messengers, the angels. People invent all kinds of crap out of that. They say, well, the angels would be moved to lust at the sight of a woman's head, uncovered head, in a worship service. Therefore, she must cover her head. It's like, what? Where do they get that out of here? Angels, first of all, are not moved to lust, and second of all, not just in a church service. That's ridiculous. So who knows, why do people get that idea? But what is Paul saying then? Back earlier in this letter, Paul made a statement about the Corinthians having trouble deciding their disputes, and he rebuked them, and then he said, don't you know that someday you will judge the angels? Well, here we got the angels mentioned again. For the sake of the angels, you at the very best, you can say we don't know what this means. But Paul did make a reference to people judging angels, and here he's saying, let the woman be the judge of what to do with her own head. I'm thinking in this context that Paul is referring back to that judging the angels thing, because she's capable of judging the angels. He did not say only the men would judge angels. He said you all, plural, would judge the angels someday. Can't you figure out your disputes? And he's saying this is the woman's decision to make. It's her head. After all, she's going to be judging the angels too. You know, she can judge this matter that concerns her and her life. Now, Paul tops it off here. He's not quite finished yet, but listen to this statement. With the master, that means, you know, in the Lord, however, woman and man are not independent of each other. For just as woman came from man, so also all men have come from women ever since. And we all come from God. Paul is completely destroying the argument that Adam had authority over Eve because he came first. He's saying, look, the first woman came from the first man, but every man since then has come from a woman. This is Paul saying this. And we all come from God. He's putting the supremacy by I got here first argument right down the sewer. I mean, you just can't ignore this statement. He's saying we all come from God. He's saying, you know, just because you got there first doesn't make you in charge. And then he finally, his last paragraph here, you all must judge as to whether it's proper for a woman to pray to God without a head covering. In other words, you figure this out. Why are you asking me? And this is another one that's twisted, and there is another translation that does do this, in my opinion, properly. Now I just lost it. I can't think of it. It's not one of the most popular ones, but they do this right. Since nature tells us nothing about this, fancy hair may be a disgrace for men, but an honor for women to whom hair has been given as a natural article of clothing. But if anybody wants to argue about it, consider that neither we nor any of God's congregations has any such custom. This passage is so mangled by most translations. He's saying, figure this out for yourselves. Let the woman decide she has authority over her own head. And nature tells us nothing about this. Almost all translations will say, doesn't nature tell you this? They turn it into a question. And they say that somehow nature tells you that men should have short hair and women should have long hair. That's what they do with this. And it actually says nature tells you nothing about this. In nature, if you just let everybody let their hair grow, everybody's hair grows long. Nature doesn't tell you anything about this. And then he goes into their culture. Fancy hair may be a disgrace for men. And the word is fancy. It's not long, even in the Greek. It's fancy, ornament, doing up your hair. Typically, in most cultures, the men may, grow their hair long or short, but they typically don't color it or, tie it up in special ways and whatnot. And he's saying, telling them that this is your cultural thing, but he says, but if anybody wants to argue about it, consider that none of us has any such custom. Okay, he's talking about culture here. What the translation twisted into is that, this is the way it is in all the churches. As if Paul is laying down a rule that women must cover their heads because their long hair is a disgrace, blah, blah, blah. It's just so mangled, this whole chapter 11. And when you go through it, though, you see that this is not what Paul's saying. They're twisting his words. And even Peter, the apostle, in one of his letters, said that Paul is hard to understand and people twist his words. There you go.
And nothing has changed.
Exactly. So let me see. One more passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34. Okay. Oh, here's the big one. Yeah. Let me read it back a little bit, given some context here. As for prophets, let a few speak while the others judge what is said. If a revelation comes to one, this is how you handle, there was chaos in their meetings. And Paul is saying, look, take your turns. If you got a bunch of prophets there, they can wait. They can take their turns and be patient. You all prophesy in turn. Everyone may learn and be comforted, because the spirits of the prophets are under their control. For God is not the God of disorder, but of peace, in all the congregations of the holy ones. A lot of translations put that with the next verse. As if they stop here, they break the thought in the middle of it. As Paul is talking about control and order for this chaos that was going on, and then they say, now I'm going to talk about women, and this is what all the churches say. So by putting this sentence, verse 33 down with verse 34 into a new paragraph, they completely change the meaning and change what Paul is saying. So this is the end of his speech about prophets and taking your turn. Then he says, and here's one where there are indications in the Greek that this is a quote. You write, the women must be silent in the meeting. They are not allowed to speak, but must be supportive, as also the law says. If they want to learn anything, they must learn from their own husbands at home, for it is vile for a woman to speak in the meeting. The law? What law? It's not in anything in the Old Testament. You can't find it. No one I've ever challenged to find me this passage has ever found it, because it's not there. The law he's talking about here is not, first of all, this is not Paul talking. This is whoever's writing to him and asking these questions and making the statement. He's not actually asking a question. He's making a rule, whoever this is, and saying that it is vile for a woman to speak in the meeting, as the law says. Well, the only law that says that is the Talmud, the laws of the Pharisees. And the word is vile. It is not merely improper. It is a very strong word that means it's disgusting and immoral and, just horrible for a woman to speak in the meeting. This is what the Talmud says. If you read it, it's very highly misogynistic, and misogynistic is too mild a term for it. So this is why this is where the statement comes from, the woman is silent in the meeting. There's no such words in the laws of Moses. So this whole quote here is something Paul is about to rebuke, and he does so with the very next word, which most translations go, or. No, it's not or. It's a strong refutation of what has just been said, and it is, what? Did the word of God originate with you? Who do you think you are? Do you think you're the only ones that God spoke to? Whoever presumes to be a prophet or spiritual must realize that what I'm writing to you is a directive from the master. Whoever is wrong about this is wrong indeed. So Paul is putting another thing to rest, and people have twisted it exactly opposite and make Paul the misogynist, making up a law that doesn't exist. So they're making him a liar too. So this was an old subject about disorder in the meetings. Then we have this kind of a sidetrack here that Paul addresses this idiocy, and then he goes back to talk about prophecy again, which leads a lot of people. If you look here, this seems out of place, this quotation section, verses 34 through 38. Take that out and read it. Let me try to highlight that whole section. Whoops, I went too far. I've gone too far. He says, as for prophets, let a few speak, take your turns. God is God of order, as in all the congregations. So then, sisters and brothers, be eager to prophesy and do not prevent people from speaking in unknown languages. That is like somebody inserted something here. A lot of people believe Paul didn't even write any of this section in green. Or they say in some of the manuscripts, the ancient manuscripts in Greek, some of them have that whole green highlighted section there at the end of the chapter, because it's like it doesn't even belong there, because you can read it and skip that section and he doesn't miss a beat. It fits right in with what Paul's been talking about. So even if somebody insists that this is not a quote and that Paul is actually saying this thing, there's a good reason to question whether Paul even wrote it, because of the context. So that whole passage has got fail all over it from whatever angle you want to pick. And it's not, and I take the conservative approach, and I say, Paul is writing this and he's quoting someone else and rebuking them. And then he goes on with what he was talking about. I'll give him that. I'm not going to try to move the passage or anything, but I don't have a problem with anybody moving it, because like I said, it fits. If you took it out, you wouldn't miss it. Not because of what it says, but because of what Paul says. He's talking about order and prophecy. So that's all I have to say about that right now. Now we're going to go on to his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5. Ephesians is a fairly mild, uncontroversial thing until it gets to the last part here, chapter 5, near the end anyway. He's giving general instructions how people should behave. And he's talking about, just raising the bar on morality and going along about it. And he says this curious statement down starting in verse 18. Don't get drunk with wine, which shows a lack of discipline, but be filled in spirit. Okay? And I got a footnote here. There's a list of items he's going to list after this. And he says they all refer back to filled in spirit. This is how it reads in the Greek. It's a list, and Paul is saying be filled with the Spirit and a bunch of sentence fragments. So this is a list. And the last item is the one where the problem comes. He's using a play on words, difficult to convey in English. And the reason is, we'll get to that, it'll make more sense when I actually read the passage. The body holds up or supports the head, okay? He's talking about a head and body metaphor a lot, and he does it in two different passages where he conveys the standard Greek belief at the time, where they believed that the body grew out of the head, and there was an interdependence between the two, which nobody would dispute. The head feeds the body, and the body supports the head and does what the head wants to do. But the head couldn't do anything without the body. It's dependent upon the body. Likewise, the body is dependent on the head. So it's a picture of mutuality, okay? Interdependence. Mm-hmm. So, don't get drunk with wine, which shows a lack of discipline, but be filled instead with the Spirit. Here's the list. Talking among yourselves with praise songs, festive songs, and spiritual songs, singing and playing music in your hearts to the Master, always giving thanks to God. And look at these ing words. These are an ongoing action. I don't want to get the proper grammatical terms that people don't want to hear anyway, but this is an ongoing thing. This is a fragment. There's no, subject, verb, object here. It's just talking, singing, giving thanks, being supportive of each other because you fear the anointed. And I'm going to look up quick this verse 521 in the Greek. Let me go here to interlinear Ephesians 5:21. Supportive. That's a big long word. Root word is hupotasso. It means being supportive, upholding, appending, attached or joined, as in legal documents where you would attach something to another document. Aligned, associated, related, loyal, committed, brought under influence. So it has a wide range of meanings, but it is to support, or by most explanations I've seen out of it, the primary meaning is to get under someone or something in order to lift it up. Okay? That's the word being used in that passage. Being supportive of each other because you fear the anointed. And look at this parenthesis. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Master. Okay, what's he saying there? Just reading it the way it is, what do you think about that parenthesis part?
Well, my first thought is that maybe it might have been added on by somebody else, but...
Possible, but what if not?
I don't know, because I'm also equally confused by looking at what my Bible says, which is nothing like what yours says.
I know, exactly. This is the way the Greek says, and I'll show you. Go back.
So what mine says is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Yeah. Well, Christ, the anointed, see the word is Christos? Mm-hmm. That's what it means. I translated what it means instead of transliterating it, just the letters into Christ. That's what Christ means. It's the equivalent of the Hebrew word Messiah, and they both mean the anointed one. Okay? So there we have it in the Greek. Be supportive of each other in fear of the anointed. See it right there. Why the woman to their own men as to the Master.
So it's not the hierarchical, it's who came from who. So we're talking about...
No. And it doesn't, most translations say, well, yes, I mean, the way you phrase it. I'm just like agreeing with you. Okay. The translations say they break the sentence there and start a new paragraph. They break it there. A lot of them do. But this goes with
on the 22nd one you're talking about?
Yeah, they break between 21 and 22, don't they?
Yes.
And they say, wives, submit to your own husbands. Where's the word submit in the Greek? It's not there.
Yeah, because where you're seeing in 21, it says supportive. On mine, it says submit. Likewise, in 22, it says submit.
Yeah, but that word isn't even there. Even if you take it as submit, it's not there. This fragment has no verb.
Oh.
Where does it get it? They stick it with what's coming when it goes with what's behind. And this is a rule of Greek grammar. If you have a fragment like that, it goes with what came before, not what comes after. So, being supportive of each other because you fear the Christ or the anointed, wives to your own husband as to the master. He's saying support your husband. Now, because there was, and this is a contextual thing, there was a law at the time in Rome called the marriage without hand. And what it meant, and this is an actual thing you can look up, was that a Roman father could marry his daughter to some man, and if he didn't like the man anymore, he could take her back and marry her off to someone else. She had no loyalty to her husband. It was only to her father. And so what Paul is saying is, no, be loyal to your husband. Okay? He just got done talking about mutual support. See, support each other. Same, there's the verb, support each other. And this word is used of each other. You cannot submit as an authority to each other. I mean, what kind of authoritative relationship is it when both of you obey the other? That makes no sense.
It's an argument waiting to happen.
Yeah. Like, you have authority over me, I have authority over you, and that's called mutual supporting, submit to each other. No, it's not about authority at all. It's support. He's been talking about mutual support the whole time before that. And he's including women in this list of ways in which you support. You talk, you sing, you give thanks, and you support each other. By the way, this includes wives to your own husbands. Your own husbands. Why your own husbands? Why would he say that? Why not say wives to husbands? He said wife to your own husbands because of that marriage without hand. He's saying your own husband, not a list of them because your father keeps marrying you off to somebody else. It's your own husband. We can't just gloss over the own, and we can't gloss over the fact that there's no verb in the Greek. It goes with the sentence before, which is mutual support. So, now, since the man is the source, there's that word head again, and they will say head in the other translations, which conveys to the reader the meaning boss, when it didn't mean that in Greek. Since the man is the source of the woman, just as the anointed is the source of the church, which is the body he saved, and we're talking about sources because what did Paul just get done saying earlier? The head feeds, the head and the body, per the Greek understanding of the day. The wives are to support their husbands in every way, just as the congregation supports the anointed. Are we talking about authority again here? No, we're talking about mutual dependence. That's the context. We're talking about the head and body being mutually dependent on each other. Neither can live without the other. And he's telling husbands and wives to do the same thing. Instead of this, and there was another rule that nobody will dispute, called the paterfamilias in Latin, I guess, where the man of the house was the absolute god of the house, and nobody, he could have his own family killed if he wanted. He could kill them himself, and nobody could say a word because he was the absolute lord and master of his home. And Paul is turning that upside down with all this mutuality talk. He's saying men and women get along, everybody in the church get along, support each other, complement, left hand, right hand, work together, and this includes husbands and wives. And we're going to prove that in the next passage, which is another one of those bookend things, those pericopes, where I mentioned it. 5:25, husbands love your wives. 5:33 down here, husband love your wife. There's the bookend. See it?
Yes.
So he opens the statement, and this is all about husbands love your wives. Now he's going to say, here's the example of how love works, how Jesus cared and loved for the church. Cared for and loved. To make her special and bathed clean by his pronouncement. A man does not do this for his wife. They take this as all what a husband does for his wife, and this is blasphemous, because he says, this is what Jesus did for the church to make her, the church, special and bathed clean by his pronouncement. This way he could present the church to congregation with himself as esteemed, not blemished or imperfect. Likewise, why would he say likewise if he's saying what men are all supposed to do anyway? This is a likewise. This is an analogy. He's saying likewise, just the way Christ did for the church, husbands must love their wives, not save their wives, purify their wives, protect their wives. We know, of course, people should protect each other. And in that culture, of course, the man had more protective responsibility. But he's saying, likewise, husbands must love their wives as they love their own bodies. After all, a husband is really loving himself when he loves his wife. This is what the anointed does for the congregation, a body of which we are all parts. In the same way, a man leaves his parents to join completely with his wife, and they become one flesh. This is exactly a quote from Moses in Genesis 1, the very end of the chapter, where Moses says, for this reason, after Adam and Eve were created, a man leaves his father and mother, unites to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's what Paul is quoting here. And notice that the man leaves his parents and joins to the wife. There are many cultures in history where that's exactly what happened. It wasn't patriarchal at all. The man would join the woman's clan. And this is what Moses said, and this is what Paul is quoting here. And I'm sure, absolutely positive, if it were the opposite, where the woman is said to leave her family and join to the man, that she would be seen as inferior for this reason. She's becoming an appendage of him, which is how they actually treat it in history, even up to fairly modern times, where the woman was, when she got married, was considered a mere appendage of the man, and so had no life of her own and no rights of her own. She was no longer a person. And in the same, so Paul is saying that the husband must love his wife as they love their own body. Since nobody ever hates their own body, they feed and care for it. That's what the anointed does for the congregation, a body of which we are all parts. In the same way, a man leaves his parents to join completely with his wife. And so, nobody's going to argue that the wife is superior because the man joins to her. But if the table was turned, I know they would. They absolutely would. They would jump all over that. And they become one flesh, not two. One flesh. This is a big secret, but I'm talking about the anointed in the congregation to emphasize every husband must love his wife if he loves himself, or else, this is a negation here, this is a contradiction in the Greek, or the wife may live in fear of her husband. They mistranslate that as the husband loves his wife, and the wife must fear her husband, obey, whatever they want that to mean. No, that's not what Paul's saying. He said that she's going to live in fear of him if he doesn't love her. And there's another passage that just popped into my head where, maybe this is the same one, where I broke that down in a blog post once many years ago. I
want to take you back to something, though. So
right.
you say it says in 532, this is a big secret.
Yes.
In the Bible that I have, it says this is a profound mystery.
Alrighty, let's go look at that. 532. The word is mysterion. It sounds like our word mystery, but it means secret. If you look it up in any dictionary, any reputable dictionary, and reminder to everybody that Strong's Concordance is not a dictionary, was never meant to be used as one. It is simply look up what a concordance is. It's just how one book uses a word, a set of words. That's all a concordance is, and it tells you where you can find it, how many times it occurs, so on. In a dictionary, an actual lexicon, It will tell you the range of meanings for this Greek word, and it does not mean a riddle to figure out. It means something, the literal meaning is kept close. Something kept close to the vest, as we might have said in English in generations past. It's something secret, something hidden, not a mystery to solve, but something that you have been keeping quiet about. Okay? That's the meaning of the word mysterion. And like I said, with this dictionary, I don't supply the meanings according to a particular passage. It has to work in every passage. So I give the whole list of meanings. And here, this is pretty short. Secret. That's the best English word equivalent. It's a secret.
My Bible's crap.
I wouldn't say that exactly. I mean, you still get the gospel out of it, but technically they can get away with that translating. So it's technically, though, that's what legalists do. They trip you up with technicalities. Anyway, there's the word large, mega. Look at that. That's where we get mega prefix. Large, big, great. That's the meaning. Something big and huge and humongous. So it's a big secret. Anyway, he's explaining that in this whole section, this pericope, these bookends about husbands loving their wives, that you may not get what I'm saying, but I'm talking about Christ and the church as a model of mutual dependency, because we are Christ's hands in this world. We are the body he left here for a reason, to do things on his behalf. We are called his ambassadors, his representatives, his witnesses. And so that's what Paul's talking about, that what the church is all about in this world. And he's using that as an illustration of, if Christ can love his church this way, and a man loves his body this way, then a husband ought to love his wife this way. That's what Paul is saying here. It's not about authority, but it gets twisted beyond all recognition. And women have suffered and died from this kind of teaching, this twisted teaching. I can't tell you, a number of websites of people who are survivors of these things, both men and women, who have suffered greatly at the teaching that the husband is the ruler over his wife. It has done terrible damage to the body of Christ for thousands of years.
Can you say why he's addressing men as opposed to addressing women?
Well, he did address women here briefly, when he said, wives to your own husbands as a master, and then he says, since the man is the source, the wives are to support their husbands. So he addressed the women first.
As part of the cooperation of who came from what, right?
Yes, this is all kind of a discussion of the last item on the list, which is support each other. He says, wives first, support him, and here's why. And then he says husbands. And then the next paragraph after that, chapter 6:1, he says children. Then he addresses slaves, and then everybody else. So he's addressing each group of people as he goes along. But he really had a lot more to say to the men, didn't he, than anyone else? Because that was a bigger problem. In that society.
Right now, if we look at in society, we are slaves, then does that 6-7 say anything we should pay attention to?
6'5", around down there. We have to understand also that slaves in that culture had a really different range of meanings than we think of, especially in the Western world today, especially in America. They were more like employees, indentured servants, and there were white indentured servants even in America. People who worked off their debts. They were debt slaves. We're all debt slaves. So it isn't as though these are, tied to the whipping post slaves. These are more like employees, and they could be set free too. So yes, it's kind of an in-between employees and slaves as we think of them. They were not largely mistreated. And in Jewish law, even in the Old Testament, they were to be set free after a certain number of years, and if they didn't want to be free, if they wanted to stay with their master, they could. But now Paul is writing to a mixed audience, okay? He's not just writing to Jews anymore. He's writing to these people in Ephesus. And he's talking to each group of people how to deal with their situation. Just like he wrote to the Corinthians about the head covering issue, He's dealing with different cultures, and he's telling them how best to work through these things wherever they find themselves, every situation. And if you, he's saying slaves should, be honest and not try to undermine their masters, not put on a show when their master's looking, but remember that God is watching them in everything they do. He's not saying slavery is good. In fact, there's a passage where Paul says, if you have a chance to be free, take it. So Paul does not condone slavery in the sense we think of it. He's just saying, I can't change all of society all at once, but I can tell you how to be a good witness within whatever situation you find yourself. That's the bulk of Paul's writings. And Peter will say some things about that too. Because later, Paul does address, I think it's to Timothy or Titus, he's going to address the masters as well, saying, don't be harsh, don't mistreat the slaves, because you have a master in heaven. Just like right here, he's saying, slaves, you have a master in heaven. He said the same thing to masters. You're a slave too, you earthly masters. So watch yourselves. You're going to be treated, you're going to be judged the way you treated others. So watch how you treat these people. So there's Ephesians. That's one of the major proof texts. Now we're going to get to the biggie, and that's 1 Timothy. Paul is writing to Timothy, his protege, not a pastor. They call these pastoral epistles, and they are not any such thing. They are advice of a missionary to another church planter. And that's not the same as the traditional pastor, and that's a whole other issue that I get into in the other video I had. At any rate, going to try to sew this up. I'm barely still scratching the surface. I'll get some links in the description for the rest of it. But 1 Timothy 2:8. Here's another, read the background. Paul is advocating above all that prayers be made for people. This is another badly misunderstood passage about praying for leaders, and the purpose is that they will leave us in peace, not so that we support everything the government does, but that's another topic. And he says, and I put this way because that's what I get the sense from in the Greek, it would be nice if the men in every place could manage to pray with clean hands and without argument. This was a problem among the men at the time, so that's why he's telling the men this thing. Okay, he's not telling women to stop arguing because they weren't arguing. They weren't fighting. So why tell them something, not to do something, or we're already not doing? So he's addressing the men with this problem because it was the men's problem. Okay, and then he says, the same goes for the women too. I'd like them to dress tastefully and decently, with modesty and good sense, not with fancy hair, expensive jewelry and clothing, but as is fitting for women who are professors for converts to Judaism while they do good things. That's something you won't read in other translations either. But
and this is 1 Timothy?
Yes. 1 Timothy
1
2.
Timothy 2. Okay.
Yeah. You won't see it written that way anyplace else. And it's not because I've got an agenda, it's because I wanted the truth, and that's just what I see in the Greek. And it's saying, and he's saying, here's what the men have a problem with, and here's what the women have a problem with. They were dressing all fancy and showing off and being indecent and flaunting their wealth.
Has that changed at all?
What's that?
Has that changed at all?
Not really.
Yeah.
Today we've got women who fight and men who show off. So, but Paul is writing to a specific group of people at a time in history, and this was the deal. So that's why he's addressing these things to these groups of people. But yeah, and he's saying, as is fitting for women who professors to converts to Judaism. Where do I get that? This is the proper meaning of the Greek reference here. Jews and God-fearers at Aphrodisias by J. Reynolds and R. Tannenbaum. And here's the book. You can go look this up. This is not something I made up. And this is what the phrase meant in ancient Greek in the first century. Okay? There were women in Judaism at the time who would train new converts. And that's the equivalent of what women in the church were doing. They could also train new converts, and he's saying, put on a good example. That's all Paul is saying here. He's saying, don't be flirty, flaunty, but instead be dignified. That's what Paul is saying here to the women. He's telling the men to calm down and be peaceful, and he's telling the women to be dignified because they had a reputation to protect. Paul, in all of his letters, is trying to protect the purity of the church by not giving unbelievers a reason to criticize it, and as much as possible. He's advocating freedom as much as it can, until the point where it starts to be counterproductive to the spread of the gospel. That's all Paul cared about. And that's why he said what he said, if you look at any given context. Now, with that backdrop, this is the biggie. And I'm going to read the whole paragraph first, okay? The woman, and I can show you this all in the Greek, the woman must learn, a specific woman must learn, and she must do so in a respectful and supportive manner. At this time, I am not even conferring teaching privileges on the woman, much less allowing her to perform fertility rites on the man. Oh, yes. I'll go back to here in a minute. I did say I want to read through that. She must be still, for Adam was formed first and then Eve afterward, and Adam was not deceived. But, negation, the woman being completely fooled. What woman? The woman he's talking about being completely fooled has crossed the line. Even so, she will be restored by the mentoring as long as they remain in faith and love and holiness with good sense. The saying is trustworthy. That was a common phrase. The saying is trustworthy. That means mark my words, take that to the bank, whatever. Now, let's look at some footnotes. Again, I did not make this up. The I am not even allowing much less can also be thought of simply neither nor, but in the context of the Artemis cult in Ephesus, this rendering seems to better fit. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. The term perform fertility rites was chosen to convey the meaning of authentine. This is that word that only occurs once in the entire New Testament, in the context of the Artemis fertility cult, wherein a priestess would teach men, then impart divine wisdom, then through sex. Reference Ancient Heresies by Katherine Kroeger. Remember, we met Katherine Kroeger earlier on when I mentioned all those women that were forgotten in history. Right. She wrote this book called Ancient Heresies, and she studied this. Now I'm going to go back up here, but first I'm going to go to the First Timothy commentary. Where are we at here? Here's the backdrop. The cultural backdrop of this letter is well established, must be considered in order to accurately interpret Paul's teachings. Timothy was in Ephesus, a large and prosperous city, one of the ancient wonders of the world, dedicated to the fertility goddess Artemis. That was the Greek name. The Roman name was Diana. Women were especially drawn to this goddess because she was believed to protect them through childbirth. There's a reason I have these words bolded. They're going to come up later. Which carried a high mortality rate for mothers at the time. They also taught that woman was superior to man and possessed secret knowledge. And since the worship rituals involved sex for the purpose of imparting this knowledge to men, naturally the men approved as well. It was also believed that the priestesses were descendants of the Amazons, who enslaved men to build the city for them. This is why they kept genealogies. We're going to read more about that. To prove their ancestry, and as Christianity spread there, some mixing of teachings arose. One such teaching was that Eve, the superior, must have preceded Adam, to whom she imparted wisdom and made fully human, thus being his savior. There's more in that I'll come back to maybe if I have time, but there's the backdrop of Ephesus, okay? That's who Paul's writing to, the church there.
Okay.
All right, so he's saying that this word authentine, or authentine, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is where I'm getting this word perform fertility rites, okay, from what I just read. That's what this word had. The connotation was negative no matter what it was. It did not mean simply have authority, because there were plenty of other words for that in Greek, and Paul used some of them in this very same passage. So this word, used only once, has only this context in the Bible, but it has a context elsewhere, but it's still rare in Greek literature. So anybody who says they know what this word absolutely means is lying or ignorant. But all we can find out about it is that it has something to do with this Artemis cult. And it involved murder, most often, and also these pagan rituals. And so whatever, it was the overpowering of another person in a negative way. And so what Paul is saying, just because he's talking about a particular woman, because of the Greek grammar, it is a woman, the woman, and saying that she can't teach, she has to, and she certainly can't do what she used to do, she has to be still because she's deceived right now. That's another thing. The woman being completely fooled has crossed a line. That is in the present tense in the Greek. Paul has switched abruptly from plural to singular, from women to woman. He has also gone from instructions for women who are already teaching to a woman who must stop for a time. But whoever she is still over the line. That's the meaning of the word trespass, is to step over a boundary at the time of Paul's writing. It's a present tense word. She is in sin at the time Paul is writing. This cannot be Eve. It cannot be Eve. He's talking about Adam and Eve because as an example of someone who was deceived. He says, Adam was first and Eve afterward, and Adam was not deceived. Paul is telling us right there what I've always said about Genesis, that the reason the serpent targeted Eve and not Adam was because Eve was made last. She did not ever see God create anything, but Adam did and knew he could not be like God. Eve did not know this. She could be fooled. And even in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says that the people are, all the people, not just the women, but all the people were being deceived like Eve. So what the thing is with Eve was being tricked. And he is saying that this woman he's talking about has also been tricked. She's thinking, coming from this cult, she may have been a priestess, it seems to be from what's implied here, and thinking that she was a priestess then, she should be a priestess now. She should be a teacher. But Paul is saying she doesn't know what she's talking about. And he prefaced his whole letter with that idea that there are false teachers who are ignorant and saying things they don't understand. And so he's saying there's a particular woman there who came from this cult, thought she could be a teacher, but says she needs to sit down and learn. Because like Eve, she has been deceived. She is still in deception, but all hope is not lost. She's not to be thrown out, even though Paul earlier said that there were two men teaching falsehood who were absolutely to be thrown out because they knew what they were doing was wrong. She doesn't know. She's sinning in ignorance. He says the solution is to teach her. She will be restored. The word there is the same word for salvation. Let me show you that in it's 2:15 in the there's a lot of more good things here at this commentary, but let me go back to the interlinear 1 Timothy 2:15. 1 Timothy 2:15. She shall be saved. The word is sozo, the root word, and this particular form of it is, you can see the grammatical information. She shall be saved, rescued, restored, or preserved. That's the range of meanings of this word. It does not always mean salvation from being lost. It also means to be rescued or restored. That's the range of meaning. Is Paul talking about salvation? Some people think so. That doesn't make any sense when you know anything about what Paul said, because Paul's all about salvation by faith. He said that to the Ephesians. He says, by grace you have been saved, to Ephesians 2:8-9. You're saved by grace, not by works, so that no one can boast. So Paul's teaching of salvation is by faith alone. But if this meant salvation from sin, Paul is contradicting himself, but he's saying she will be saved by the mentoring. Now let's look at that word, because a lot of translations will say the word is childbearing, and it is, but let me explain. Parentage. The word is technogonius. This word is also used only once in the entire New Testament. There is a form of it used elsewhere, and it has to do with raising children. Okay, it says the bearing and raising of children. Almost always this literal meaning, okay? So is Paul saying that a woman is saved by bearing children? I don't think so. And most commentators would agree with me on that, because Salvation by childbirth, as one person put it, is salvation by works of a very curious nature. In other words, she has to have sex and have babies, in other words, to be saved, and that's preposterous. Absolutely blasphemous. So it cannot mean salvation from sin. What does it mean? She's being restored. Look at the whole passage. He's talked about false teachers. He singled out a particular individual here, a woman who has been deceived like Eve was, because she didn't know any better. She needs to sit down and be taught before she can teach, and she can be restored by mentoring. That's what it seems that technogonia seems to mean here. That, again, is a word only found once in the New Testament. I'm trying to make sense of it here in this passage and consider the whole context. And she needs mentoring. She needs teaching. So to say that, this is restoration. That's what mentoring is. It's bringing you to a point, back to a point where you need to be. And so what he's saying is that this woman can be restored by the childbearing, the mentoring, the raising of a person. And then this statement goes with it, as long as they, who are they, remain in faith and love and holiness with good sense. People twist that, even translators, and try to make sense of it because Paul is mixing the number of persons involved, like she, they, woman, women, and they just mush it all together and make it all the same to make sense of it in English the way they want it to. But it says...
And he's really meaning church?
Well, yeah, he's talking about the rest of the church mentoring her, as long as they remain in faith and love and holiness with good sense. It's impossible for this to refer to Eve as the woman in sin, whose sin has infected only the women, curiously, never the men she gave birth to, the boys, but they never think about that. But the point is that Eve cannot possibly be saved by the actions of women far in the future being holy and knowing their place. That's the teaching they twist this into. It's just unbelievable how they, can, with a straight face, can do these things. But this is held to be probably the most controversial passage in the New Testament, but it's only controversial because of prejudice, because of presumptions, because of assumptions about what a woman's proper role is, and they read that into the text and then read it back out. And so, as Paul, or as Peter understated it, once again, Paul's writings get twisted. They get misunderstood because he's not writing to children. He's writing about deep things here. And in this case, you might want to ask at this point why he doesn't name the woman. Well, he typically, as his habit is, only names people who are dangerous, people who are going around from one church to the next spreading error. He does name some false teachers earlier on, as I mentioned, and says, and the purpose of naming is to warn the other churches about these people. But in this case, he does not want to shame the woman. He wants to restore her. He's being kind to her and saying she can't teach yet. She has to sit down and learn. Okay? I'm looking at this holistically and not like an accountant or dissecting a specimen on a table. You do dissection just to learn certain things about the structure, and I'm doing that with the grammar and the meanings of words. But when it comes to someone writing a letter, you got to think holistically too. And I'm doing so on the basis of technical facts, historical facts, and the culture and the context. And just common sense reading the passage. It's like, he's clearly, the letter is about false teachers. And if you don't gloss over and change the text by trying to make all the pronouns match, you can figure this out. And I go into that more in detail in the commentary, which I should have kept that link open, but I need to move on. Another passage in 1 Timothy is, and we're near the end here, chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. Okay. He's talking about what to do with widows who in that culture had no support. He's talking about if they have other family that can take care of them, the church should not be burdened with them. Okay. So he's saying about how to determine which widows deserve the church's support. And he talks about, this is badly translated all the time, decline younger widows because whenever they want to marry again, they're likely to rebel against the anointed, bringing in the verdict that they have broken the pledge. This is what it means in Greek, the pledge. Pledge instead of the literal first faith, because the subject here is Christian widows not losing faith just to remarry. People take that wrong. He's not saying that people are abandoning Jesus just so they can remarry. He's saying that we're talking about young Christian widows who made a pledge of celibacy and, as a godly thing. And he's saying, yeah, it's not a good idea when they're young. This is in keeping with his overall holistic teaching about married couples and whether marriage is a good idea for Christians and all that. And he's saying, don't put young widows on the support list because they're likely to remarry and have their own support anyway. And, don't let them take this kind of a pledge of purity or whatever you want to call it. And then he talks about them being busybodies. This is not a blanket condemnation of women for all time. All women don't do this. He's talking about young widows in that culture who, if they had support, would go around being busybodies because they didn't have to worry about any, where their food and shelter was coming from. So he's saying his recommendation, I would prefer the younger ones to marry, raise a family, take control over their household. Ooh, you won't see that in any translations. But that's what it is in the Greek. Let's go look. 5:14. This is, still in 1 Timothy 5:14. We'll get there pretty close here. Let's go back one. Take control of their household. Look at this word. Where to go? To parent. To marry, have children, to their own house. That's to own the house. I'm saying their own house. I'm saying to own or absolutely rule the house. The word, you can see the word despot in the Greek word. It says oiko is two words, oiko meaning house, and despotin, ruler, lord, master of the house. The young women. He says, I want the young ones to marry, have family, rule their house so that no one has any grounds to criticize us. They're telling the women to just be sensible and do what they can in their society. And they needed, instead of being busybodies, to look after the house they were neglecting. So he's telling them that they are in charge. He's saying this to the women. You are the house despot. That's what the Apostle Paul is calling them. And then he says, for some have turned to follow the adversary. Some who? Who's the nearest antecedent? That means the word, the nearest identified group. Critics. Not the women. Not the women who are turning away to follow the adversary. It's the critics. That's what the footnote is about. So he's saying that if the women are irresponsible, it gives the critics a foothold and a reason to follow Satan because these Christians are being a bad example. That's all he's saying there. Be a good example so that you don't give Satan a foothold and give him a reason, give people a reason to go chasing after Satan because they're like, look at these Christians, they're irresponsible, they neglect their homes. That's all Paul is about. And he says, like I mentioned earlier, if any believing woman is related to widows, she should support them. She should support them. A believing woman related to widows, she should support them instead of burdening the church with them. So he's telling women to be responsible caretakers and manage their houses. Never once is a man called the house despot. Never once. Never once is he called the head of the family or the head of he's called the head of his wife. But remember what we said about head in 1 Corinthians 11? Doesn't mean boss. But she is called the house ruler. Word kefali is not there at all. It's despot. You know, it's pretty clear. So there you are, another passage down. That was first to be 5. Now we're going to go. We got two more passages. Two more passages. 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. All right. He starts off just, general instructions. This is Peter now, not Paul. Talking about behavior mostly. And he talks about us all being a royal priesthood. And then he says, watch how you live among the unbelievers. So he's saying the same thing as Paul. Watch what kind of impression you give to the unbelieving world. And then he talks about servants. He's going down a list like Paul did. Servants, support your employers, slaves, masters, however you want to put it. And he's telling them that Jesus is their example. Follow Jesus' example, wives. Likewise, in the same way, we're drawing an analogy here, a similarity. Slaves had a difficult thing to do, and they had to be careful. Wives also. It's not a coincidence that wives are listed in the same thing as slaves, because they both had a similar predicament in that culture. Support your own husbands, so that if they are hostile to the word, they may be won over without words by means of their wife's behavior. Don't only let them see outward adornment, but the inner person, the underlying perfection of a meek and quiet spirit that is priceless in the sight of God. This whole passage, I'll just keep reading, then I'll go back. This is how holy women rely on God, outfitting themselves with support for their own husbands. Be like Sarah, who called Abraham master. I'll get into this. You become like her in doing good and not fearing, nor being distressed. That's how you be like Sarah. Don't fear, do good, don't fear, don't worry. Husbands likewise, build a home together with them in keeping with the realization they have the less stable income. This is weakly translated weaker vessel. It is a term in that culture and time, in that language, that meaning that they were at a social disadvantage, an economic disadvantage, okay? Honor these feminine ones as the joint heirs, not sub-heirs, of favor and life that they are, or your prayers will be impeded. It's a very strong word in the Greek. But let me go back. What he's saying here, and if you look at the grammar, it is the men, let me get down here, let's see, so that if they are hostile, let me go back, they are hostile. This is not backsliding Christian husbands here. This is unbelieving pagan husbands married to a Christian woman, and she has very little she can say to him. She could be killed just for opening her mouth. And so she can't witness with her words, okay? So that if these men are hostile to the gospel, they may be won over without words by means of their wise behavior. In other words, he's telling them, look, you're in a tough situation. Do the best you can with it. I'm not going to overturn society. I'm telling Christians how to do their best in this situation. And women, Christian women married to unbelieving husbands, had a really hard life because they couldn't say anything. This is not a Christian woman who's not allowed to talk to her Christian husband. This is a very, very different situation. And who is it that will realize that will in fear? In most English translations, it's portraying the woman as the one who should fear her husband. But no, he's saying, grammatically, if you look at the Greek, that word fear goes back to the man. It is matching the grammatical gender, goes back to they, the husbands who are hostile. They will realize in fear that your behavior is pure and godly. In other words, they will back down because they know they don't have any reason to criticize you because you are living an exemplary example of a Christian woman. So they don't have any grounds upon which to get rid of you or hurt you. He's trying to protect the Christian women in this situation. And he's saying, let them see the inner person. Don't just present a pretty exterior to these men. Be beautiful inside. And he's saying, this is the example of the holy women of God. Be like Sarah, who called Abraham master. You know what the only time is she ever called him master? Was when she laughed at the prospect of bearing a child by her very elderly husband. Abraham was, let's see, 99 when God appeared to him and told him he would have numerous offspring. And he was childless all his life. Sarah was barren. She was, I think, 90-something herself. And when she heard God say this, she laughed to herself because she thought, will my master be able to do this, make this happen? She thought it was going to happen naturally. And that's the only time she called him master. The other 2 times that she actually did what Abraham said was when he was trying to save his own skin in a foreign land by passing her off as his sister, so that nobody would kill him to get his wife. So anyway, but Peter is not saying be like Sarah by calling Abraham master. You become like her in doing good, not fearing, not being distressed. So that gets twisted and mangled all to pieces, because people will say, you must be like Sarah and call your husband your master, your Lord. That's blasphemy. That's not what the scripture is saying. He's saying you become like her when you're not afraid, and when you behave by presenting a good example, and you don't worry. Don't be a worrywart. And then he has an admonition for husbands. Build a home together with them, in keeping with their realization that they're at a very great social and economic disadvantage. Honor these feminine ones as joint heirs of the favor is the word we normally translate grace, but kind of lost its meaning in some ways. The favor granted to the lesser from the greater, that's the grace of God. Anyway, honors them as joint heirs of that grace or favor and life that they are, or your prayers will be impeded. This is a hindering of prayer. This is not just that God will not answer your prayers, but that he will actively block them. So this is very strong warning to the husbands. You better treat your wife good, or God will be against you. And then Peter says the goal of all of this, and it wasn't just wives, it was slaves as well he was talking about, is for all of you to be in agreement, to be sympathetic, caring, fond of other believers, and humble, without taking revenge or matching inflamed rhetoric. And, he's just good advice. And if you understand the culture, sometimes that good advice was really, you had to be careful with it, because you get somebody killed. Okay, the last passage, a very interesting one. That people gloss over. It's very short, fortunately. It's 2 John verses 1 and 5. 2 John has only 1 chapter. It's just a short letter. You can see right there, that's the whole thing. The elder, John calls himself, to the chosen master and her little ones in the faith. Ooh. And in some of my writings, I explain that the Greek, like the Strong's Concordance totally is blatantly biased here. There's a bunch of different forms of the word kurios, from which we get is the word Lord or master or sir. All of those are range of meaning. And in every instance, the male form is used, and it's always translated as a very, respectable, sometimes authoritative when it says Lord or master, when it's talking in the male form. This one lone female form, the only other, well, there's 2, and the only other one is in this same chapter letter. It's verse 5 down here. It says, where's verse 5? Now I'm asking you, madam. I did it, madam, as if I would do sir if it was a man, madam and sir. And this the same word there, the same root word. But he's writing to a woman of dignity and position here. Some have tried to make up a new feminine name, Curia, just to avoid the fact of the connotations of Lord and Master here. Because if it was used for a man, that's what you would do, Lord, Master, Sir, whatever. They make another fallacy of special pleading by changing the meaning in their concordance in just this one instance. No such woman name has been found, and like I said, these are the only two places in the entire New Testament that has it, and you'd be hard-pressed to find that name in Greek literature of the first century. So he's calling her the chosen master, or the elect, some will say elect lady. Lady, and I could accept in the terms of lords and ladies like they do in Great Britain. Perhaps it's an archaic term. But in modern English, they're getting away with murder by saying lady because they know we're not going to take that as seriously as a woman of influence or a position of authority, or not so much authority as in boss, but as in she is the leader of a church. Who else would John be writing to? He's not right. If he was writing to a family, he would write to the man in that culture. And little ones in the faith, is he really talking about her own children? No, he's talking about in the faith. He's talking about a congregation, and she's the leader. And this is the context in which we find it here. No, it was actually the other letter, sorry. But he's talking about not inviting certain people into your home. Well, the church met in homes. And so he's saying, don't let these people in as one of you in your congregations, in your meetings, because you're giving approval to their false teachings. But anyway, we've met Chloe before as someone with followers, meaning someone who was running a church congregation. And so here's this elect lady. He just doesn't name her, but you got to ask why he's not writing to a man if he's writing to somebody's family. And if he's writing to a church, he's writing to a woman most clearly. And nobody has tried to do a gender bender on her. They instead made up a name for her that never existed before. So I got to stop. It's been, 3.5 hours? I never meant to go that long.
Well, that's what it took to cover all of this.
Yeah, and I just scratched the surface.
So what I want to say to all of this is that this for me shows up as another thing about life that the powers that be or whatever have done everything they could to make sure that they kept it a secret and twisted it just like flat Earth.
Exactly. Layers and layers and layers going back hundreds, even thousands of years. But we could find it. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
We can't be defeatist about it. So yeah, there's I will put more links in the description when this is done, and for further reference, you really got to do your own research, but this I hope will get people started. I mean, you don't know to research unless you know there's a problem. So I'm hoping that at least was accomplished, that here's a problem. Yeah, I could be wrong about a lot of stuff, but you have to admit that at least the first half of it with the Old Testament and part of the New with the historical parts, the Gospels and Acts, are pretty hard to debate. Especially in light of the overarching principle that I mentioned in other videos about Jesus' teaching about humility and lack of hierarchy and the example that he gave. It's just, that's a core teaching. So this really does hit on being a salvation issue in some respects. Not that if you don't agree with me, you're not saved. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that it indicates how well you understand what Jesus came to do and what lengths people go to read into a text what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. And we are orders of magnitude more difficult and well, we can't get as close as we'd like to scientific investigation, and the same thing is true with history and linguistics. We have a huge gap to cover here, and people who use what is called the plain reading method, what I call the surface skim or lazy method, where they don't concern themselves with the context, they don't concern themselves with the original languages, they don't concern themselves with much of anything but proof texting, or what is called helicopter theology, where you pick up a snippet of a sentence and lift it up and drop it someplace else by mashing all parts of the Bible together as if that's dishonest or something. It's not. It's the exact opposite. When you're reading the context, you have to, you don't do that helicopter thing. You realize that people write letters as you would write letters, and they're not being done in a vacuum. These are not, it's unfortunate that people put verses in the Bible, because verses tells you more like an incantation or a poem. There are poems in the Bible, but not everything is a poem, and they're not verses as in poetry. They're verses as in magic or something, or pagan writings, or Nostradamus or something like that. These aren't those kind of verses. And it's unfortunate that they use that term. They should have just marked them as sentences and paragraphs. And just for, I can see the need to be able to find a certain spot easier, but at what cost? I mean, making it verses also breaks up the paragraphs and allows them to do the things that you saw there, especially with Ephesians, where they break a verbless fragment and make it into a new sentence in a new paragraph just because technically they can get away with it. Right. So I need to stop. I'm very parched and tired, and I will, I don't see a whole lot of questions. I didn't pay any attention to the chat. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully I didn't miss too much.
No.
Unless there was something you said. Anybody have a question? Bill Fox, do you have fancy hair?
Yeah.
Jibby has fancy hair sometimes. I've seen him braid it. That's just so wrong. Yeah. Picking on Jibby. It's because we like him, right? Anyway.
Yeah.
So let's see.
Well, thanks for all the research and everything it took for you to put all this together.
No problem.
Even though I'm sure it's been years that you've been doing this. Yeah,
this is not something I woke up yesterday and decided to do, that's for sure. But the Hangout, yeah. Not the other stuff.
True enough.
So, yeah, more linkies to come for anybody who cares. And there's a lot more stuff at my YouTube channel as well. So there you are. Thanks for all two of you or whoever came, and spread it around if you can. I'm sure other people could benefit from at least asking the right questions, as they said in iRobot. Yeah. So see everybody.
All right. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for coming and hanging out. And for our silent partner here, I won't name right now. And I will push the stop button.
All righty.